What if everything you think you know about human history is missing 6 chapters? What if the civilization you're living in right now, with its cities and satellites and smartphones, isn't the first time humans built something like this? What if it's not even the second or third time? What if it's the 7th? I know how that sounds, but stay with me here, because the evidence for this is stranger and more compelling than you'd think. We're taught a simple story. Humans were hunter-gatherers for hundreds of thousands of years. Then about 12,000 years ago, agriculture happened, cities happened, writing happened, and civilization marched forward in basically a straight line ever since. Some bumps along the way, sure, wars, plagues, the occasional dark age. But essentially one continuous project, building higher and higher. But that's not what the geological record shows. That's not what ancient myths from cultures who never met each other keep describing over and over again. Floods that drowned the world, fires that fell from the sky. Golden ages that ended in catastrophe, followed by centuries or thousands of years of people barely surviving, forgetting everything their ancestors knew, and starting over from almost nothing. 6 times, at least 6 times. By the reckoning we're going to walk through in this video, human civilization got knocked down hard enough that it basically had to reboot. Cities abandoned, populations crashed, knowledge lost. And 6 times we clawed our way back up, rebuilt, reached new heights, only to get hit again. We're calling what we have now Civilization 7. And here's the unsettling part. One of those 6 resets came so close to finishing us permanently that it's honestly a miracle you're alive to hear this sentence. Not a slight scare, not a bad century. An honest-to-God brush with total extinction, the kind of event that, if it had gone just slightly differently, would have meant nobody ever built a pyramid, or a printing press, or a rocket, because there would have been no one left to try. Over the next while, we're going to dig into all of it. The Younger Dryas Cataclysm and the world that vanished with the Ice Age. The floods that show up in nearly every ancient culture's mythology, from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, and the actual meltwater pulses that may explain why. The Bronze Age collapse, when an entire interconnected network of empires fell apart within a few decades. The Black Death, the late antique Little Ice Age, and a supervolcano that may have pushed our species to the edge of oblivion tens of thousands of years before that genetic bottleneck we just talked about. We'll look at the myths. We'll look at the ice cores, the sediment layers, the archaeology. And at the end, we're ranking all 6 resets, worst to least bad, to figure out once and for all which one came closest to writing the final chapter of the human story before it really got going. So if you're new here, or if this is the kind of thing that helps you drift off at night, go ahead and follow the show on Spotify. Links right there in the description. Costs nothing, helps a lot, and tell me, where in the world are you listening from right now? And what time is it there? I check these every single time, and it never stops being wild. Someone in Sydney getting ready for their morning coffee while someone in Toronto is finally closing their eyes for the night. Now, let's go back to the beginning of the beginning. Back before civilization number 1. Long before geologists started drilling ice cores and archaeologists started carbon dating pottery shards, ancient people were already telling a story that sounds remarkably similar to the one we're about to walk through. They just told it in a different language. The language of myth. In Hindu cosmology, there's a concept called the yugas, cycles of time that move through 4 distinct ages. It starts with the Satya Yuga, a golden age of truth and virtue, when humans supposedly lived for hundreds of years and understood the universe with perfect clarity. Then things start to slide. The Treta Yuga arrives, still good, but a quarter less virtuous. Then the Dvapara Yuga, where things get murkier, humans grow more selfish, lifespans shrink, and knowledge starts slipping away. And finally, the Kali Yuga, the age we're supposedly living in right now, according to traditional Hindu timekeeping. An age of conflict, ignorance, and moral decay, where truth is hard to find and civilizations are, in a sense, running on fumes compared to what came before. Here's the part that should give you chills. These aren't small increments of time we're talking about. The full cycle of 4 yugas, called a Mahayuga, is said to last 4.32 million years, and the whole thing repeats, over and over, endlessly, creation, decline, collapse, and rebirth forever. It's not a straight line of progress, it's a wheel. Now, you could dismiss that as religious cosmology with no connection to actual history, and maybe it is. But it's worth asking why so many completely separate cultures with no contact, no shared writing system, no trade routes connecting them, kept landing on the exact same basic idea. A golden age, a decline, a catastrophe, a restart. Look at ancient Greece. The poet Hesiod, writing around 700 BC, described what he called the ages of man. 5 of them, actually, though they map almost perfectly onto the same declining arc as the Yugas. First came the Golden Age, when humans lived like gods, without toil or grief, and the earth provided food without anyone having to work for it. Then the Silver Age, when people grew foolish and disrespectful, and Zeus wiped them out. Then the Bronze Age, a brutal, war-loving generation that destroyed itself with its own violence. Then, oddly, a brief age of heroes, the demigods and warriors of Greek legend, Achilles, Heracles, the men who fought at Troy. And finally, the Iron Age, Hesiod's own time, an age of exhausting labour, moral corruption and constant hardship, which he describes with something close to despair, wishing he'd been born earlier or later, any time but now. Sound familiar? A perfect beginning. A slow unravelling. Violence. Collapse. And a present age that feels like a shadow of what once was. That's not a coincidence you'd expect to see twice, let alone across completely unconnected civilizations separated by thousands of miles. Because it doesn't stop with the Greeks and the Hindus. Travel to the American Southwest, and you'll find the Hopi people whose oral traditions describe not ages but entire worlds. 4 of them in most versions. The first world destroyed by fire. The second world destroyed by ice. The third world destroyed by a great flood. And our current world, the 4th world, which the Hopi believe is also heading toward its own kind of ending unless humanity changes course. Each collapse in Hopi tradition comes because humans grew arrogant, forgot their spiritual responsibilities, and stopped living the way they were meant to live. Sound like anything we've heard already? Head south into Mesoamerica, and the Maya and their neighbouring cultures had their own version, recorded most famously in the Popol Vuh, the sacred narrative of the Quiche Maya. In that account, the gods attempt to create humanity multiple times, and multiple times they fail. First, they try to make humans out of mud, but the mud people dissolve, unable to hold a coherent shape. Then they try wood, and the wood people survive but are hollow, thoughtless, and are eventually destroyed by a flood and by their own tools and animals rising up against them. Only on the 3rd or 4th attempt, depending on the version, do the gods succeed in making humans out of maize, the people who would become us. Some Aztec traditions go even further, describing 5 separate suns, 5 distinct ages of creation, each ending in a different catastrophe, jaguars devouring everything, hurricanes, fiery rain, floods, and finally our current age, the 5th sun, which is prophesied to end in earthquakes. Here's where it gets genuinely strange, and worth sitting with for a second. Across the Hindu Yugas, the Greek ages, the Hopi worlds, and the Mesoamerican suns, you keep bumping into similar numbers. 4 ages here, 5 there, sometimes stretched to 6 or 7 depending on how a particular tradition counts its transitional periods or its minor cataclysms. It's not an exact match. Cultures don't hand you a tidy, identical number like clockwork, but the pattern of multiple attempts, multiple collapses, multiple restarts shows up again and again, and when you total up the transitions across these traditions, you keep landing somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 or 7 distinct eras, which, if you're keeping track, is exactly the number we're building toward in this video. Now, to be clear, nobody's suggesting that ancient Hindu priests or Greek poets or Hopi elders had access to ice core data or sediment layers from the bottom of the Black Sea. That's not the claim here. The claim is something a little more unsettling, and honestly, a lot more interesting. What if these stories are folk memory? What if, buried underneath the religious language and the moral lessons about virtue and corruption, these myths are actually distorted, generation-flattened accounts of real events? Real floods, real fires, real collapses that genuinely happened, and that got passed down by word of mouth for so many centuries that by the time anyone wrote them down, they'd been dressed up as cosmic morality tales instead of history. It's a controversial idea. Mainstream archaeology tends to treat these myths as symbolic, not literal, and there are good reasons for that caution. Stories evolve, details get exaggerated, numbers get stylized to match sacred or culturally significant patterns rather than actual headcounts of collapsed civilizations. We should hold on to that skepticism as we go, but we should also hold on to the coincidence, because it really is a striking one. Culture after culture, continent after continent, with no possible contact between them, all converging on the same basic shape of history. Not a straight climb upward, a cycle, rise, decline, catastrophe, forgetting, and eventually rebuilding from something close to zero. So here's what we're going to do with the rest of this video. We're going to set the myths aside for a bit, not because they're irrelevant, but because we want to test them against something harder. Ice cores, sediment cores, radiocarbon dates, abandoned cities buried under mud and ash. We're going to walk chronologically through 6 proposed resets in human history, real, physically evidenced collapses, starting with the world that existed before the Ice Age ended, and ending with the industrial world that gave rise to the one you're living in right now. And when we're done, we're going to come back to this idea of cycles, and ask whether the ancient storytellers, in their own strange mythologized way, might have been onto something after all. To get to our supposed 7th civilization, we have to start with something that doesn't usually get called a civilization at all. Picture the world around 15,000 to 12,000 years ago, at the tail end of the last ice age. Vast ice sheets still smothering Canada and northern Europe. Sea level more than 100 meters lower than today. The English Channel wasn't a channel, it was a cold, windswept plain. Indonesia wasn't a scattered necklace of islands, it was a single massive landmass called Sundaland. Coastlines were miles farther out. Whole continents, as we'd recognise them on a modern map, looked wrong. And across this strange planet, the official story goes, were only hunter-gatherers. Small bands, moving with the seasons, following herds, collecting nuts and berries, living in temporary camps and maybe the occasional rock shelter. No cities, no states, no kings, just simple foragers. Except when you start zooming in on the late Pleistocene, that picture starts to fray. By this point, humans had already been smart for a very long time. They knew how to make complex stone tools. They managed fire with precision. They hunted mammoths and bison with coordinated group tactics that would put modern weekend warriors to shame. They had art, cave paintings, carved figurines, personal ornaments. They had long-distance trade in obsidian, shells, pigments. These weren't animals stumbling towards civilization by accident. These were people with culture, memory, and networks. And then, on a dusty hill in what is now southeastern Turkey, somebody did something utterly out of character for simple hunter-gatherers. Göbekli Tepe. On paper it shouldn't exist. It's dated to around 11,600 years ago, give or take. That's well before the textbook invention of agriculture, before permanent villages are supposed to appear, before pottery, before metal, before writing. And yet, what you find there are massive stone circles with pillars weighing up to 20 tons, some carved with intricate reliefs of animals and abstract symbols, multiple enclosures layered over centuries, architectural planning, shared iconography, labour coordination on a scale that, according to the standard model, we weren't supposed to be capable of yet. The people who built Göbekli Tepe, as far as we can tell, were still foragers. They hunted gazelle, wild boar, birds. They gathered wild grains, nuts, fruits. And somehow they mustered the surplus time, energy, and organisational skill to quarry, move, and raise megaliths that would challenge even later farming societies. That creates an awkward question. If hunter-gatherers were capable of that level of social complexity, what else might they have been capable of in places we haven't found yet, or that we physically can't access anymore? Because remember those lower sea levels? When the ice sheets locked up all that water, shorelines were pushed far out. The most attractive spots for humans, river deltas, bays, sheltered coasts with rich marine life, were not where the coastline is today. They were on what is now the drowned continental shelves under tens of meters of water. And this is where the idea of Civilization Zero creeps in. Not skyscrapers and smartphones, not steel and satellites, but something between a foraging band and a Bronze Age city. A dense, semi-sedentary, coastal world of villages and ritual centres, of trade routes along shorelines, of people who weren't yet farmers, but also weren't just wandering aimlessly through the wilderness. We get hints of this in the archaeology we can actually see. Submerged stone structures off the coasts of India and Japan, drowned Mesolithic sites in the North Sea, in the area now called Doggerland, where we find evidence of settlements, tools, and sophisticated exploitation of wetlands. Submerged terraces and possible harbour works in the Mediterranean that date back earlier than later classical civilizations. Most of these finds are small, fragmentary, hard to interpret. They're not lost metropolises with street grids and libraries, and mainstream archaeologists rightly are cautious. Erosion underwater is brutal. Natural rock formations can look misleadingly geometric. Dating submerged sites is notoriously difficult. When you hear wild claims about cities 30,000 years old mapped from blurry sonar scans, skepticism is not just healthy, it's mandatory. But you don't need Atlantis to make the story interesting. It is entirely reasonable, even conservative, to say that thousands of late Ice Age and early Holocene settlements that once existed on now drowned coastal plains are simply gone to us. Not hypothetically, mathematically. If humans hugged the coasts, as they still tend to do, and if sea level has risen more than 100 meters since then, a huge portion of our early built environment, whatever scale it had, is now inaccessible without massive underwater archaeology campaigns that we've barely begun. Put Göbekli Tepe back into that context. A Temple Hill complex inland, surviving by sheer luck, while its coastal cousins, if they existed, were slowly eaten by the post-glacial sea. Suddenly, the idea of widespread, organised, pre-agricultural societies doesn't sound like a fantasy novel. It sounds like a plausible extension of a pattern we've already seen. This is where the phrase Civilization Zero becomes useful, not as a proven historical label, but as a thought experiment. Imagine a world of complex hunter-gatherers and early experimenters with cultivation, seasonal aggregation sites with monumental architecture, Regional pilgrimages that brought groups together to feast, trade, arrange marriages, and reaffirm shared myths. Social hierarchies starting to harden, ritual specialists emerging, knowledge transmitted through elaborate oral traditions. Not a civilization in the classical sense. No cities of tens of thousands. No writing, but a proto-civilized layer of human organization that sits uncomfortably between the world of nomadic bands and the first clearly documented farming villages. Do we have ironclad evidence that such a civilization zero spanned the globe? No. What we have are outliers like Göbekli Tepe, traces of submerged settlements, and a growing realization that our ancestors at the end of the Ice Age were far more socially and cognitively complex than the old primitive hunter-gatherer stereotype allows. So we hold two ideas at once. On one hand, the mainstream caution. Extraordinary claims need extraordinary evidence, and underwater sonar images and mythic stories of golden ages do not, by themselves, prove an advanced, lost civilization. On the other hand, the open question. Given what we already know about human ingenuity, about lower sea levels, about the fragmentary nature of the archaeological record, how comfortable are we assuming that what we've found so far is all there ever was? Because whatever you want to call that late Pleistocene world, complex forager networks, proto-civilization, civilization zero, it was living on borrowed time. The ice was melting, the climate was swinging wildly, sea levels were beginning a rapid stepwise rise. Entire landscapes that had been stable for thousands of years were about to flood, fragment, or vanish. And buried somewhere in that turbulence is one of the sharpest jolts in recent Earth history, a sudden cold snap and possible cataclysm that many researchers think might have slammed the door on Civilization Zero and forced humanity into its first great reset. That moment has a name, the Younger Dryas. The Younger Dryas starts like a cruel joke. You've just spent thousands of years climbing out of an ice age. Glaciers are retreating, temperatures are rising, plants are creeping north. Lakes are filling. If you're part of Civilization Zero, life is still hard, but it's trending in the right direction. Seasons are becoming more predictable. Game is moving into newly opened valleys. Wild grains are ripening in places that were once frozen desert. Then, in climate terms almost overnight, the world slams back toward glacial conditions. Roughly 12,900 years ago, global temperatures, especially around the North Atlantic, drop sharply. Within a human lifetime, maybe even within a decade or two in some regions, what had been a warming, moistening landscape snaps back to cold, dry, and hostile. This is the Younger Dryas, about 1,200 years of near Ice Age chill wedged right into the middle of an otherwise smooth warming trend. To appreciate how shocking that is, imagine if our current global warming suddenly reversed next century and Chicago started getting Siberian winters again, while Northern Europe turned into a tundra scrubland. Not over 5,000 years, over your grandparents' lifetime. That's the kind of climate whiplash we're talking about. The basic outline is not controversial. You see it in ice cores from Greenland, neat layers of snow laid down year after year, with isotopic signatures suddenly shifting toward colder temperatures. You see it in pollen records from lake sediments, forests retreating, tundra plants returning. You see it in glacial geology, ice margins stabilizing or even advancing again. Something big happened. The fight is over the trigger. One camp argues for what you might call the plumbing disaster model. As the great North American ice sheets melted, they created enormous proglacial lakes, including a monster known as Lake Agassiz. If a natural ice or sediment dam gave way, billions of tons of fresh water could have poured into the North Atlantic in a geologic instant. That sudden pulse of cold fresh water would disrupt ocean circulation, especially the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. the system that helps transport warm water north. Shut that down or weaken it, and northern hemisphere temperatures can plunge. It's an elegant idea. No aliens, no magic, just ice, water and ocean currents. But beginning in the early 2000s, another, much more dramatic story pushed its way onto the stage: the impact hypothesis. According to this theory, the Younger Dryas wasn't just a glitch in the climate plumbing. It was kicked off by a cosmic sucker punch, one or more fragments of a comet or asteroid exploding in the atmosphere or striking the ice sheets of North America and maybe other regions. Supporters of this idea point to a weird package of evidence right at the onset of the Younger Dryas, in a thin layer at many sites across North America, parts of Europe and the Middle East. That layer sometimes shows platinum spikes. Platinum is relatively rare in Earth's crust, but common in some meteorites. Around 12,900 years ago, at multiple locations, sediment cores show a noticeable jump in platinum concentrations. Something dumped extra platinum into the environment on a broad scale. Nanodiamonds. These are microscopic diamonds that can form under the extreme pressures and temperatures of an impact or high-energy airburst. Researchers have reported unusual concentrations of nanodiamonds in that same boundary layer at some sites. Black mats. This is the informal name for dark, organic-rich layers that cap late Pleistocene deposits at many North American localities. Under the black mat, you find bones of mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, and other megafauna. Above it, those big animals are gone. The mats often contain soot, char, and signs of widespread biomass burning, suggesting massive wildfires. Taken together, impact proponents sketch a picture like this. A broken-up comet or swarm of debris hits the atmosphere, detonates over the ice sheets, and maybe the continent itself, vaporizes huge amounts of ice and rock, ignites continent-scale fires, dumps platinum and nanodiamonds into the air, and sends enough dust, smoke, and water vapor into the atmosphere to mess with climate on a global scale. Temperatures crash, ice retreats, stalls, ecosystems reel. Layered on top of this is the human story. Right around this time, the late Pleistocene megafauna, the charismatic giants of the Ice Age, vanish in a sudden wave of extinctions, especially in the Americas. Mammoths, mastodons, American horses and camels, giant beavers, saber-toothed cats, short-faced bears, gone within a relatively tight window. Some of this decline appears to coincide with Younger Dryas onset and those black mat layers. At the same time, the earliest well-documented culture in North America, the Clovis tradition with its distinctive fluted spear points, seems to falter. Clovis sites become scarce or disappear. Later cultures emerge with different toolkits. To impact enthusiasts, this looks like a smoking gun, a cosmic disaster that not only wiped out the megafauna, but also shattered early human populations, collapsing an entire way of life. Zoom out globally, and you see other hints of stress. In the Levant, the Natufian culture, semi-sedentary foragers who were flirting with early cultivation hit a rough patch as the climate snapped colder and drier. Some previously settled groups seemed to become more mobile again, retreating from early village life. In Europe, recolonization of newly opened lands stalls or reverses. Everywhere you look, the world's ecological and human experiments at the end of the Ice Age are being stress-tested to the breaking point. So was this our first great reset? Did Civilization Zero take a direct hit from the sky? Here's where we have to separate possibility from proof. The impact hypothesis is controversial. For every study that claims a clear platinum spike or nanodiamond signature at the Younger Dryas boundary, another paper questions the methods, the dating, or the interpretation. Some black mats may be more like wetlands and soil horizons that formed over centuries, not instantaneous disaster layers. Other researchers point out that massive wildfires can be driven by climate shifts alone. Drought and vegetation change can make landscapes tinder dry without needing a comet. Meanwhile, the freshwater pulse explanation has its own uncertainties. The exact timing and pathways of meltwater outbursts are hard to pin down. Some reconstructions suggest the big floods into the North Atlantic happened earlier than the Younger Dryas, or later, or in multiple pulses. The ocean circulation models are improving, but they're not perfect. And there's a third axis: humans. Even if the Younger Dryas did hammer megafauna and early cultures, people are incredibly adaptable. Genetic data suggests that human populations bottlenecked and shifted, but did not come anywhere near species-level extinction. Local and regional collapses, yes. Cultural resets, definitely. But total annihilation? No. Which brings us back to our ranking. If you're looking for events that could have wiped the slate so hard that any hint of Civilization 0 was erased, coastal settlements drowned, inland networks shattered, food chains rearranged, the Younger Dryas is a prime suspect. A 1,000-year cold relapse triggered by a huge meltwater disruption would be bad enough. Add the possibility of a cosmic impact layered on top of that, and you have a double-hit scenario that could absolutely crush fragile, early complex societies and push survivors into simpler, more mobile lifestyles. By the time the Younger Dryas finally relaxes around 11,700 years ago, the climate lurches back into rapid warming. Sea levels begin another surge, ecosystems reorganize yet again, and almost immediately in places like southeastern Turkey, we see Göbekli Tepe and its piers, monuments rising in a world still staggering from 1,000 years of chaos. Was that monument building a continuation of Civilization 0, or a reinvention by people who had just lived through an apocalypse? To answer that, we have to watch what humanity does with the new warmth, the rising seas, and the empty ecological niches left behind. That's where Civilization 1 begins. Civilization 1 is born into a hangover. The Younger Dryas finally lets go. Temperatures snap upward. The ice retreats again, this time for good. But the people stepping into this new Holocene world aren't starting from zero. They're starting from -1. Their grandparents and great-grandparents watched climates flip like a light switch. Herds vanish. Rivers change course. Whole landscapes turn from parkland to steppe, and back again within a few lifetimes. Whatever Civilization 0 had built, long-distance trade routes, ritual centres, experimental fields of half-tamed grain, was shaken hard. Some of it survived in fragments, some of it did not. Now, around 11,700 years ago, and after, things finally calmed down relatively. The early Holocene is like the first deep breath after a panic attack. Climate graphs smooth out, the wild temperature oscillations of the last glacial period fade. You get something our species hadn't seen in a very long time: stability on the scale of millennia. But stability from an Earth system's perspective is not the same as comfort from a human perspective. To you and your neighbours, life still means daily improvisation. The glaciers are melting, but that also means rivers flooding unpredictably, as ice dams fail. Sea levels are climbing, quietly but relentlessly, eating away at low-lying coasts, metre by metre over generations. Forests are advancing into what used to be open hunting grounds. Animals you relied on are tracking those habitat shifts, sometimes disappearing from your region entirely. Civilization 1 begins as a series of local responses to this moving target. In the Levant, descendants of the Natufians regroup. During the Younger Dryas, many had been forced back into more mobile lifestyles. Now, as rainfall patterns stabilize and wild cereals spread, those same groups start edging back towards semi-permanent settlement. Instead of wandering widely, they return to the same valley floors and upland terraces season after season, building more durable houses, digging storage pits, experimenting with tending, not just harvesting, stands of wild barley and wheat. This is not farmers appear overnight. It's slow, halting, frustrating. You watch which patches of ground produce the fattest seeds. Maybe you scatter a few during harvest. Maybe you don't. Maybe you pull out competing plants just a bit. You notice that seeds fallen near camp do better when the soil is scratched, dung has been trampled in, and last year's chaff lies as mulch. Across hundreds of years, these micro-decisions stack. The line between wild harvesting and cultivation blurs, then quietly vanishes. At the same time, your shelters change. If you know you'll be returning to the same place next year, it makes sense to invest. Post holes go deeper. Walls get thicker. Roofs are rebuilt, not abandoned. Some sites show circular houses giving way to more rectilinear layouts, an early whisper of the streets and courtyards that will one day define cities. In Anatolia and Upper Mesopotamia, a different experiment is playing out, Göbekli Tepe, which first rose during or just after the Younger Dryas, as a monumental gathering place for mobile hunter-foragers, enters its later phases. The earliest massive T-shaped pillars and enclosures begin to be buried, deliberately backfilled. New, smaller structures go up. Stone circles become more compact, more domesticated in scale. Around the wider region at places like Nevali Chori and later Catalhoyuk, you start to see something that looks less like a pilgrimage site and more like permanent habitation. Here's where some researchers entertain a provocative idea. What if there were surviving knowledge bearers, people whose ancestors had been part of more complex networks before the Younger Dryas crash, who helped seed these new cultural developments? Not bearers of secret laser technology or lost power grids, but something more realistic and arguably more important, mental templates. How to organize large feasts. How to coordinate labor beyond a single clan. How to encode stories in stone and ritual so they outlast living memory. In this view, the later phases of Göbekli Tepe and its regional cousins might be Civilization One's attempt to rebuild some version of lost complexity, using the materials still at hand, stone, grain, animals, and a hard-earned sense that the world can change brutally fast. It's speculative. We don't have a charred ledger tablet from 13,000 years ago recording the collapse of an earlier kingdom. But the pattern is familiar. After historical collapses, after Rome in the West, after the Bronze Age palaces, there are always pockets where old skills and ideas are preserved just long enough to be repurposed by the next wave. Scribes in monasteries, craftsmen in backwater towns, oral historians in marginalized groups. Civilization One could easily have had its equivalent, elders carrying stories of how, in the time before the Great Cold, our people traded with distant strangers and gathered in even larger circles. Those stories, retold around fires, become blueprints for what's possible once conditions allow. Even with this cultural scaffolding, the recovery is glacial by our standards. From the end of the Younger Dryas to the appearance of fully agricultural villages in multiple regions is on the order of thousands of years. The earliest clear evidence of domesticated wheat, barley, lentils and goats in the Fertile Crescent sits around 10,000, 9,000 BCE. That's 1,500 to 2,500 years after the climate stabilized. Imagine telling a modern audience, society collapsed in the year 2000, and we finally got back to stable small-town farming by the year 4,500. That's the tempo we're dealing with. Populations are low, life expectancy is short. One bad sequence of droughts or epidemics can erase a whole valley's worth of progress. If you manage to build surplus one decade, the next might force you to eat your seed grain. Every step toward sedentism, toward planting, storing, building more permanent structures, locks you into that land a little more, makes you more vulnerable if the rains shift or a river carves a new path. Civilization one is not a triumphant rebound. It's a careful, tentative negotiation with a planet that has just shown how dangerous it can be. And above everything looms the ice. Yes, the glaciers are retreating, but they are still vast. The great ice sheets of North America and Northern Europe are like sleeping giants dissolving into water. That meltwater has to go somewhere. Over the next several millennia, pulses of fresh water will surge into the oceans. Sea level, already more than 60 meters higher than during the glacial maximum, will continue to rise another several dozen meters before it stabilizes. For people clustered along rich coastal plains and river mouths, this is both blessing and ticking time bomb. Newly flooded estuaries teem with fish and shellfish. Wetlands support birds and reeds and game. Early settled communities are drawn to these fertile edges, building exactly where the ocean's slow encroachment will hurt them most. Civilization one is rebuilding on ground that is literally moving beneath its feet. As villages expand, as herds become more managed, as fields of grain become more common, the next reset is already being prepared, not by comets this time, but by the meltwater of the dying ice age itself. Because when that much ice turns to liquid, the planet doesn't just warm. It floods, and those floods are going to carve themselves into human memory as myth, as legend, and maybe as the next great reset in our cycle. Sea level doesn't rise like water in a bathtub. It lurches. From the end of the last glacial maximum to about 7,000 years ago, the oceans climbed more than 120 meters. Most of that rise was relatively steady, spread over thousands of years. But tucked inside that overall climb are spikes, moments when the line on the graph kinks upward, briefly, terrifyingly faster. These are the meltwater pulses. You might have heard of Meltwater Pulse 1A, a huge jump around 14,600 years ago, maybe linked to massive ice sheet collapses and quick sea level rise on the order of tens of meters in just a few centuries. That one probably hit late Civilization 0 and the early Younger Dryas world. But for Civilization 1, the first farmers, fishers and coastal settlers, the more relevant story is what came after the Younger Dryas. As the climate stabilized into the Holocene, the big North American and Eurasian ice sheets didn't just politely shrink. They failed in chunks. Glacial lakes trapped behind ice dams broke loose. Ice margins retreated off continental shelves. The most dramatic of these later surges is known as Meltwater Pulse 1B, roughly around 11,500 to 11,000 years ago, though the exact timing and magnitude are still debated. What matters for us is the order of speed. Instead of a few millimeters of sea level rise per year, you get rates several times higher. Add that up over the lifespan of a single human, and an elder can point to places that used to be dry land and are now part of the sea. To your community, it doesn't look like a smooth, distant process playing out on a graph. It looks like this. The shore where your grandparents foraged is now a sandbar you only reach at low tide. The old campsite at the river mouth, with its hearthstones and shell middens, is gone, replaced by churning surf. The brackish lagoon that fed you fish and reeds becomes a bay. The bay becomes open sea. Multiply that across the planet. In Southeast Asia, the vast continental shelf between what is now Vietnam, Borneo, Java and Sumatra floods, drowning a whole subcontinent modern geologists call Sunderland. In the north, the English Channel opens as Ice Age river valleys flood, cutting Britain off from mainland Europe, and swallowing the low-lying plain of Doggerland that once connected them. In the Persian Gulf, lowlands turn into the drowned basin we see today, what some researchers think may have been a rich, habitable area before it went under. Each of these regions could have supported dense clusters of early Holocene people, fishing communities, shellfish collectors, seasonal camps that were on their way to becoming something more permanent. Civilization 1 was drawn to coasts and estuaries like iron filings to a magnet right as the magnet itself was sliding into deeper water. And this is where myth walks onto the stage. You already know some of the hits. Noah and his ark riding out a deluge that drowns all flesh outside a chosen remnant. Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, warned by a god to build a boat and preserve the seed of every living thing, as the world is scoured by flood. Manu in the Indian tradition, guided by a fish avatar of Vishnu to build a ship and tie it to a peak while waters engulf the earth. Deucalion and Pyrrha in Greek myth, surviving Zeus's flood by clinging to a chest and later repopulating the land. Once you start looking, you see versions of this story almost everywhere. In Mesoamerica, Maya and Aztec traditions describe previous worlds destroyed by floods before the current age. Among many indigenous groups along the Pacific Northwest, there are stories of people escaping on canoes as waters rise to cover the mountains, or as a great sea wall races inland. In Australia, Aboriginal songlines tell of shorelines that used to be further out, of islands that were once connected to the mainland, of ancestral camps now under the waves. Stories that some linguists and geographers argue have been passed down for thousands of years. It's tempting, very tempting, to draw a straight line between those narratives and meltwater pulses. Picture a fishing village at the edge of Sunderland 11,000 years ago. Over the last few generations, the sea has been creeping closer. Salt is poisoning wells that used to be fresh. Sandbars that sheltered your canoes have shifted. Then one spring tide, boosted by a storm and a background rise in sea level. A surge pushes far inland, ripping houses from their foundations, sweeping people, animals, and stored food out to sea. From your point of view, this isn't a local flood event during a period of rapid eustatic sea level change. It's the end of the world. You survive only because your uncle insisted on dragging the boats uphill just in case. When the waters finally recede, half your kin are missing. The shoreline is rearranged beyond recognition. Your old landmarks are gone. You don't forget that. Your children don't forget it either, because you tell them again and again. Once, the sea rose higher than the trees. Once, only those who listened and prepared had any chance. Now imagine similar episodes scattered across coastlines from the Black Sea Basin to the Bay of Bengal, from the North Sea Plain to the Gulf of Mexico. Not one single global tsunami, but a patchwork of regional disasters, all amplified by a world where the baseline is already a relentlessly rising ocean. This is the heart of what some researchers propose, that global flood myths are not pure invention or purely symbolic, but cultural memories of very real, very disruptive inundations during the last phase of deglaciation. Not precise eyewitness reports, but stories compressed, mythologized, and stitched into religious and moral frameworks over hundreds of generations. The pattern fits in intriguing ways. The timing lines up with the period when sea level was still climbing fastest, roughly 12,000 to 7,000 years ago. The very window when early agricultural and proto-urban communities are taking root in river deltas and coastal plains. The details sometimes match local geography uncannily closely. Oral traditions describing now submerged reefs, channels, or island chains that modern bathymetry confirms. And we know humans can, under the right circumstances, preserve surprisingly old environmental memories. Some Pacific cultures retain detailed knowledge of land lost to eruptions and shoreline shifts for many centuries. A few scholars argue that certain Aboriginal stories in Australia encode shoreline positions from 7,000, 8,000 years ago with rough accuracy. But there's a catch, and it's important. Most historians and mythologists are cautious, even skeptical about cleanly mapping specific geological events onto specific myths. Oral traditions evolve, motifs spread from culture to culture. Floods are an almost universal human experience. Rivers burst their banks everywhere. Water is an incredibly convenient symbol for purification, chaos, and divine wrath. You don't need a meltwater pulse to invent a story where the gods get angry and wipe the slate clean with a deluge. So we're in ambiguous territory. On one side, you have geologists and a few anthropologists pointing to timing, local detail, and the sheer ubiquity of flood cataclysms in myth, and saying, there's probably something real under this. On the other side, you have scholars warning against confirmation bias, reminding us how easy it is to cherry-pick narratives and retrofit them to whatever disaster you're currently interested in. What we can say carefully is this: the end of the last ice age produced flooding on a scale no human alive today has ever seen. Whole landscapes vanished within spans of time small enough for grandparents to walk their grandchildren to the new shoreline and say, "We used to live out there." Civilization 1, trying to settle farm and fish in river mouths and coastal plains, repeatedly had to retreat, rebuild, and rethink where safe land actually was. Those retreats weren't always orderly. Sometimes they were panicked, flights uphill as storm surges and high tides rode on top of a higher sea. Whether or not any single myth encodes a particular meltwater pulse, the combined effect was a cultural environment saturated with stories of watery endings, worlds drowned, peoples reduced to a handful of survivors, humanity starting over on higher ground. In our framework of cycles, this is the second major proposed reset. Not as sharp and sudden as the Younger Dryas crash, not a single day when the sky fell, but a drawn-out, drowning that kept ambushing communities just as they were learning to sit still. A reset not by ice this time, but by its ghost, water creeping and sometimes surging into the lowlands where Civilization 1 was trying to take root. The next step in the pattern is almost inevitable. Once people finally find land high and stable enough, once they regroup away from the fickle coasts, something remarkable happens. Fields become more reliable, villages knit into networks. Surplus appears often enough to support new kinds of specialists. Civilization 2 is waiting on the terraces above the floodline. When people finally stopped running from the shoreline, they did something our species had been flirting with for thousands of years, but never fully committed to. They planted and stayed in the hills and river valleys of what we now call the Fertile Crescent, an arc stretching from the Levant through northern Mesopotamia into the Zagros foothills. Wild stands of einkorn and emmer wheat had been growing since long before the ice retreated. Hunter-gatherers knew these plants well. They had been harvesting them with stone sickles, parching and grinding the grains, learning the quirks of their growth. But after generations of flooded coasts and drowned campsites, the logic shifted. Instead of chasing the good spots, you brought the good spot to you. At first, it barely looked like farming. People scattered seeds from the best wild stands near their camps. They weeded a bit, protected patches from animals, maybe diverted a little water. Over time, without anyone intending to invent agriculture, the plants that did best near humans were the ones humans liked most: bigger seeds, less brittle husks, stalks that didn't shatter when touched. The same quiet revolution played out with goats, sheep, cattle and pigs. Hunters who knew animal migration routes inside out started corralling, culling and breeding selectively. You don't wake up one morning in 9000 BCE and say, "Today we shall domesticate Bos taurus." You just keep a few docile aurochs near camp, because it's easier than always going out after them. A century later, your grandchildren are living in a village that smells like manure and milk. By around 10,000 to 8,000 BCE, the Near East is dotted with communities that are no longer just camps. Places like Jericho, Abu Huraira, and later Katahoyuk grow into dense clusters of mud brick houses, storage pits, communal structures. The ratio of wild to domesticated plant remains in the trash layers flips. You see less gazelle, more sheep bones, less seasonal abandonments, more rebuilding on the same footprint, again and again. Population follows the grain. A hunting band tied to seasonal migration might comfortably support a few dozen people. A well-watered farming village with cereals, pulses and livestock can support hundreds. Put multiple villages along a river or across a fertile valley, and you start getting regional populations that are an order of magnitude larger than anything in the Paleolithic. More mouths demand more land, but they also generate something new in human history: persistent surplus. Not every year. There are still bad harvests, late frosts, insect plagues. But in a decent year, a well-managed field gives you more calories than your family can immediately eat. So you store it in baskets, in clay bins, in plastered silos. Grain becomes time-shifted energy. It's the first real battery civilization ever builds. And once you have batteries, you can power specialists. Some people stop spending all day getting food and start spending time doing other things, knapping better blades, making finer pottery, learning the seasonal rhythms of distant valleys and showing up to trade at exactly the right moment. You get part-time priests, full-time potters, local strongmen who organize irrigation ditches and, suspiciously, always seem to have slightly fuller granaries than anyone else. Trade networks thicken and stretch. Obsidian from Anatolia shows up hundreds of kilometers away. Shells from the Red Sea make their way inland. Exotic stone, pigments, and crafted goods move along routes that link village to village, valley to valley. This isn't yet the world of caravans and written contracts, but the outline is visible. People are specializing, exchanging, depending on strangers they will never meet. Çatalhöyük in central Anatolia is one of the clearest windows we have into this Neolithic boom. Imagine a settlement with thousands of people living cheek by jowl in a honeycomb of houses pressed so tightly together there are no streets. You walk across rooftops and climb down ladders through smoke-darkened openings into rooms plastered and replastered over generations. The walls are painted with elaborate scenes, hunting, wild animals, possibly even abstract symbols and maps. Burials are tucked beneath house floors, ancestors literally under your bed. Inside those rooms are storage bins full of grain, racks for drying meat, platforms for sleeping, spaces for ritual. Outside the settlement are fields of wheat and barley, herds of sheep and cattle grazing lands that are no longer purely wild. This is not yet a city in the classic sense. There is no palace, no temple towering over the rest, no written bureaucracy. But it is unmistakably more than a simple village. It's dense, complex, symbolically rich, economically plugged into a wider world. Proto-urban is not an exaggeration here. The blueprint of later city life is already visible in miniature. Now zoom out from the Fertile Crescent. Similar, though not identical. Stories are unfolding in the Nile Valley, in the Indus region, in parts of China, in the green highlands above drowned coasts. Everywhere the climate has settled into the relatively warm, relatively predictable pattern of the early Holocene, people are exploiting that stability. They clear forests, terrace slopes, dig channels, and slowly, almost unconsciously, bet everything on the idea that next year will look a lot like this year. This period imprints itself on later memory. Across cultures you start seeing myths of a lost golden age when the earth gave freely, when humans and the land were in balance, when work was lighter and life more harmonious. The Greek poets talk about a time when men lived like gods, free from toil and grief. In Mesopotamian tradition, before kingship descends and the great cities rise, there is Eridu, a paradisal first settlement by the water. In some Near Eastern and Indo-European myths, there is a first garden, a first ordered field, a time before heavy ploughs and kings' demands. It's easy to romanticize early farming life. In reality, Neolithic villagers worked hard, faced disease, injury and conflict. But compared to the chaos of the late Ice Age and the drowning coasts, the early Holocene really did offer something unprecedented. Several millennia of relatively gentle climate, reliable growing seasons, and slowly maturing social systems. Stability that lasts for many generations feels, from the inside, like the way the world is supposed to be. And that's exactly where the trap lies. Civilization II's superpower, its ability to extract enormous energy from a narrow slice of the environment, is also its Achilles heel. Fields of a single grain variety are fantastically productive, until a pest or blight appears that loves that grain even more than you do. Villages clustered around one dependable spring or river channel thrive, until that water source shifts course, dries up, or becomes contested. By concentrating people, food, and dependence on a few key resources, the early agricultural golden age quietly increases systemic risk. A drought that would have been a hardship for scattered foragers can become an existential crisis for a tightly packed farming community. A shift in rainfall patterns that would once have nudged migration routes now threatens the very foundation of settled life. For a while, the Holocene keeps its side of the bargain. Seasons come and go on a rhythm your grandparents recognize. Planting calendars work. The river floods, more or less on cue. Then, about 8,200 years ago, something in the climate system jolts. Ice in faraway North America, fresh water pulses in the North Atlantic, atmospheric circulation, whatever combination of factors you prefer, conspires to break the smooth line of Holocene stability. Temperatures dip. Rainfall patterns skew. For the first time since people committed to fields and herds, the environment lurches underneath a sedentary civilization. And Civilization II is about to find out how resilient, or how fragile, its golden age really is. For climatologists, the 8.2 Kiloyear event looks almost modest on a graph. A sharp little dip in temperature, about 6,200 BCE, lasting maybe a century and a half on the global scale, with the worst of it packed into just a few decades. But for people who had just bet everything on stable seasons, it was like the ground rules of reality quietly changing. The trigger, as far as we can tell, was water. A lot of it in the wrong place, all at once. Up in what's now Canada, the last big remnants of the Laurentide ice sheet were still melting. Trapped behind walls of ice were enormous proglacial lakes, basically inland seas of glacial meltwater. One of them, often called Lake Agassiz Ojibwe, sat precariously against the ice dam that held it in. At some point that dam failed. Whether it was a slow undercutting or a catastrophic break, the outcome was the same, an outburst flood that dumped a colossal pulse of fresh water into the North Atlantic, probably via Hudson Bay or the St. Lawrence. Cold, low salinity water spread across the ocean surface, disrupting the conveyor belt of currents that normally carry warm water north. Shut down or weaken that conveyor, and the climate responds fast. In Greenland ice cores, you see it as an almost vertical line, temperatures dropping by several degrees in a human lifetime. Across the North Atlantic region and much of the Northern Hemisphere, the pattern seems to have been cooler summers, harsher winters, and crucially for farmers, shifts in rainfall. Some areas dried, others swung toward erratic flood-prone seasons. This wasn't another Younger Dryas. It didn't last a millennium. It didn't rewrite whole ecosystems on a planetary scale. But it landed like a sucker punch precisely because of its timing. 9,000 years earlier, during the Younger Dryas, your ancestors could move. They were still mobile, still living in small bands, still able to pivot to new resources when old ones failed. Now, in 6200 BCE, you are a farmer in a Near Eastern village with fields of wheat and barley, orchards just beginning to mature, flocks tethered to a particular valley and its water. You have investments in place. You have infrastructure. You have neighbours, obligations, debts, and the calendar starts to lie. Rains come late, or not at all, or they arrive all at once and wash out your seedlings. A few degrees of cooling means a shorter growing season at higher elevations. Frosts creep into months that used to be safe. Year after year, the predictability you've built your life on wobbles. Archaeological layers from this period in parts of the Levant and Anatolia show exactly what you'd expect from a slow-motion crisis. Temporary abandonments, shifts to hardier crops, heavier reliance on herding over intensive grain farming, sometimes a visible contraction in settlement size. In some regions, long-occupied sites thin out or vanish. People don't disappear, they move, and when they move they run into water in another, more dramatic way. Enter the Black Sea. Today, it's a vast inland sea connected to the Mediterranean by the Bosporus and Dardanelles. But there's a long-running debate among geologists and archaeologists about what it looked like 8,000 years ago. One influential hypothesis, the Black Sea Deluge hypothesis, popularized in the late 1990s, argues that at the end of the Ice Age, the Black Sea basin was a much smaller, mostly freshwater lake, isolated and sitting well below global sea level. As ice melted and oceans rose, the Mediterranean crept up toward the narrow sill at the Bosporus. Then, at some point around the 8.2 Kiloyear event, the Mediterranean finally overtopped that sill. In this scenario, the strait didn't just trickle, it roared. Salt water from the Mediterranean cascaded into the Black Sea basin in an immense waterfall, carving and deepening the channel, rapidly raising the level of the inland lake by tens of meters. Shorelines would have marched inland at a pace you could measure in human lifetimes, maybe even in a single generation. If you were living on those shores, fishing, farming low terraces, building villages at the water's edge, you'd watch your world literally drown. How fast and how catastrophic this really was is still debated. Some researchers see evidence for a relatively sudden marine intrusion and massive shoreline retreat. Others argue for a more gradual connection, stretched out over centuries instead of decades. But even the more conservative models still imply big changes: salinity shifts in the basin, altered fish populations, coastlines on the move, and pressure on any communities that had treated the old lake margin as home. Now put the two things together. You have a climate system that has just hiccuped, cooler, drier, more erratic in key agricultural zones. You have sea levels that have been rising steadily since the end of the Ice Age and, in some regions, may now be surging faster as flooded corridors open. You have early farming societies that are heavily localized, still relatively small scale, but deeply dependent on water and stable seasons. What happens? People start walking. Villages near marginal lands, higher, drier uplands, or coastlines being eaten by encroaching seas become less viable. Communities fall back toward the most reliable rivers and springs, or they head into new territories that used to be someone else's hunting grounds. That means friction, competition, negotiation, marriage alliances, raids. Some archaeologists see around this time an uptick in defensive architecture. More palisades, more ditches, more signs that communities are worried about their neighbours. Others see rapid spread of certain crops and farming techniques into Europe, as if farmers suddenly fanned out along rivers and coasts instead of expanding slowly, generation by generation. Climate shock plus rising water is a powerful migration engine. It may also be a powerful story engine. Across the broader Near East and Eastern Mediterranean, you get later traditions of a great flooding of the lowlands, of gods angry with humans, of waters overtopping their bounds. The famous Mesopotamian flood of Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the later Hebrew story of Noah, Greek tales of Deucalion, all of these are stitched together over millennia, layered, reinterpreted, and certainly not simple eyewitness accounts of one specific event. But in a world where coasts have been creeping inland for thousands of years, and where one particular pulse of change ripped through both the atmosphere and the seaways, it's not hard to imagine that memories of sudden loss, of fields swallowed, of lakes turned to seas, fed those myths. The 8.2 Kiloyear event and any associated Black Sea flooding were not global civilization killers. They did not erase humanity the way a supervolcano might, or slam us back into the Paleolithic. Instead, they acted like a stress test. They were the third proposed reset, smaller than the Younger Dryas catastrophe, less spectacular than the great meltwater pulses that drowned the continental shelves, but perfectly timed to expose the vulnerabilities of a world that had just discovered fields, villages, and surplus. Civilization too bent, adapted, and in many places survived. But it did so by moving people, rearranging landscapes of power, and perhaps planting some of the oldest, deepest stories we carry about a time when the waters rose and the seasons turned against us. And out of that turbulent century or two, something new began to crystallize. As farming spread into fresh lands and old heartlands restructured, the foundations were laid for a different kind of human settlement, denser, more hierarchical, plugged into trade and ritual on a scale no village could handle alone. The era of isolated farming communities was ending. The age of cities was about to begin. Civilization 3 begins quietly, in mud. Not mythic marble or gleaming bronze, just river silt, piled up year after year along 3 floodplains that would change everything: the Tigris-Euphrates, the Nile, and the Indus. By 4000 BCE, the scattered farming villages of Civilization 2 had stopped being an experiment. In a few key regions, they were becoming a system. Start in southern Mesopotamia, in the land that later generations would call Sumer. Here the rivers were both a gift and a threat. They flooded unpredictably, shifted channels, dumped salt into fields. But if you could tame them, if you could cut canals, build levees, coordinate planting and harvest, you could turn desert into a food machine. No single village could do that alone, so people started clustering. Hamlets grew into towns. Towns fused into something new. Places like Uruk, which by around 3500 BCE may have held tens of thousands of people. For the first time in history, you get a human settlement that feels qualitatively different. Not just bigger, but denser, more specialized, layered. You can't have 10 or 20,000 people in one spot without full-time organizers. Irrigation managers, storehouse keepers, priests, scribes, craft specialists, soldiers. Food surplus didn't just allow hierarchy, it demanded it. And with hierarchy comes paperwork. In Sumer, you can watch one of the most consequential inventions in human history unfold in clay. First you get simple clay tokens, little shapes that stand for 1 jar of oil or 10 sheep. Then people start pressing those tokens into clay envelopes, then imprinting their shapes directly onto flat tablets. Somewhere in that bureaucratic escalation, a mental flip happens. Instead of a clay lump that is a sheep, you get a mark that means sheep. Instead of counting things, you start representing words. By about 3200 BCE, the earliest true writing, proto-cuneiform, is on the scene. At first, it's all grain rations, temple receipts, and labour tallies. But once your culture has a working system for preserving language, it's only a matter of time before myths, laws, and royal boasts join the account books. Writing is not just a tool, it's a memory prosthetic for an entire civilization. While Sumer is carving wedges into clay, the Nile Valley is performing its own experiment in scale. Egypt's advantage is different. The Nile floods are more regular, more predictable. The river is a calendar, rising and falling with a rhythm farmers can trust. But the river is also a spine, a long, narrow strip of life bordered by desert. Unify that strip, and you control everything that matters. Around 3100 BCE, that's exactly what happens. The details are still debated, but the archaeological and later textual record point to a political fusion of Upper and Lower Egypt under a single ruler. The symbol of that unification is a crown. The reality is centralized extraction. Egyptian civilization takes the logic of surplus and hierarchy and pushes it into the realm of spectacle. Pyramids, mastabas, massive temple complexes. These are more than tombs or shrines. They are proof of concept, proof that you can command tens of thousands of labourers, organise quarrying and transport across hundreds of kilometres, feed and house everyone, and keep the whole machine running for decades to raise stone against the sky. The ideology that makes this possible is just as monumental as the architecture. The king is not just a strong man, he's a divine figure, a cosmic hinge between gods and humans. Religion, governance, and irrigation management blur into a single system. Disobeying the state becomes, in a sense, disobeying the universe. Farther east, along the Indus River and its tributaries, another model of city life emerges, one that still puzzles archaeologists. By around 2600 BCE, the Indus Valley, Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, and dozens of other sites boasts some of the most advanced urban planning on Earth. Gridded streets, standardized brick sizes, sophisticated drainage and sewage systems, granaries, workshops, possible civic or ritual baths. What you don't see, at least not clearly, are giant palaces or obvious royal tombs. The writing system is still undeciphered. There are seals, weights, standardized measures, clear signs of a complex economy, and some authority-enforcing norms, but the face of power is strangely muted. 3 different river systems, 3 different political and religious arrangements, all converging on the same basic experiment: stack humans together, specialize their roles, and let surplus tie it all into a single organism, and then plug those organisms into each other. By the mid-3rd millennium BCE, it's not just that Uruk or Memphis or Mohenjo-Daro are big, it's that they're connected. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan shows up in Mesopotamia and Egypt. Indus seals turn up in Mesopotamian ports. Timber, metals, grain, textiles, luxury goods, everything starts moving along expanding webs of trade. Interconnectedness makes these early civilizations more powerful. A drought in one region can be cushioned by imports from another. A shortage of copper in Egypt can be solved by trading grain for Cypriot ore. Ideas move too. Gods, myths, technologies, even writing systems cross borders and mutate. But every new link is also a new dependency. Civilization 3 is built on rivers. On the flood pulses of the Nile, the capricious waters of the Tigris and Euphrates, the monsoon-fed flows of the Indus and its now-vanished partners like the Gagahakra, sometimes linked to the legendary Saraswati. When the rivers behave, the system hums. When they don't, cracks appear fast. We have early hints of this in the records. Sumerian city-states squabbling over canal rights, accusing each other of damming or diverting water. Royal inscriptions boasting of dredged channels and rescued harvests, propaganda that only makes sense in a world where failed floods mean famine. In Egypt, later texts like the Famine Stela tell stories of 7 years of failed inundation, of kings scrambling for solutions. Whether specific accounts are literal history or political myth, they reflect a fundamental truth. If the Nile's annual gift shrank for too long, the entire system would be at risk. In the Indus realm, the silence is more archaeological than textual, but it whispers the same warning. Shifting river courses, signs of changing monsoon patterns, ports left high and dry as coastlines and channels move. Urban centres that once sat astride thriving waterways eventually find themselves stranded. Urban civilization magnifies what's at stake. In a village world, a bad decade might kill a community or scatter it. In a city world, a bad decade can starve tens of thousands, topple dynasties, gut trade networks that reach across continents. Civilization 3 is the first time humanity builds something big enough that its collapse would not just be local heartbreak, but regional catastrophe. And by the late 2nd millennium BCE, that catastrophe arrives. Climate wobbles, migrating peoples, war, earthquakes, trade disruptions across a huge swath of the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. The system that cities had woven together starts to tear. The first real age of cities was also the first age where a collapse could cascade. The Bronze Age world was about to find out what happens when a whole network fails at once. By 1250 BCE, Civilization 3 is a humming machine stretched from Greece to Mesopotamia. On the Anatolian plateau, the Hittite Empire rules with iron will and bronze blades, squeezing tribute from vassal kings and guarding the land routes between east and west. To the south, Egypt is in its Ramesside glory, statues of pharaohs towering over the Nile floodplain. Along the Levantine coast, Canaanite port cities grow fat on trade, handling cargoes from Cyprus, Crete, and beyond. Out in the Aegean, palace complexes at Mycenae, Pylos, and Tiryns dominate their hills, hoarding grain and gold, sending out ships and warriors. It is a world of letters and ledgers. Kings in Hattusa write to pharaohs in Thebes on clay tablets, complaining about late shipments of gold or asking for princesses in marriage. Merchants record cargo lists. Scribes copy legal codes and diplomatic treaties. Bronze, this carefully balanced alloy of copper and tin, undergirds the whole system. Copper from Cyprus, tin from far-flung sources that might be as distant as Central Asia. Trade is not a luxury, it is infrastructure. And then, over the course of a single human lifetime, it falls apart. Between about 1220 and 1170 BCE, the eastern Mediterranean turns into a burn scar. Archivists in Ugarit, a thriving port in what is now Syria, are still sending out desperate letters as the fire front closes in. One tablet from a local official to the King of Cyprus reads like a siren. Enemy ships are already here. Our cities are burned. The enemy's hand is mighty. There is no grain. Shortly after, Ugarit is ash. Its archives are buried in collapsed buildings. The next time anyone lives there, centuries have passed. Across the region, the pattern repeats. Palaces torched. Storage jars smashed. Fortifications assaulted and sometimes hastily rebuilt, only to be destroyed again. Within a few decades, many of the glittering centres of the late Bronze Age world are abandoned ruins. Who did this? Ancient Egyptian inscriptions blame a shadowy coalition they call the Sea Peoples. Reliefs at Medinet Habu show Pharaoh Ramesses III triumphing over strange enemies arriving by both land and sea. Warriors with feathered headdresses, women and children in ox carts, ship prows locked in battle. For a long time, popular imagination turned the Sea Peoples into a kind of Bronze Age superhorde, a mysterious external invader sweeping in from nowhere to erase civilization. But the closer archaeologists look, the messier it gets. Some scholars see the Sea Peoples not as one unified nation, but as a patchwork of displaced groups: migrants from the Aegean, refugees from earlier collapses, mercenaries switching sides when the pay runs out, pirates turned opportunistic raiders when trade convoys weaken. Others think some of the Sea Peoples were actually long-standing players in the region, rebranded as villains by Egyptian propaganda. And even if you grant them a major role in the violence, the timing suggests they were riding a wave, not creating it. Underneath the stories of mysterious attackers, something deeper is going wrong. Pollen records from lake beds and marshes across the eastern Mediterranean show a sharp shift around 1200 BCE. Trees decline. Drought-tolerant plants rise. At the same time, correspondence from the period is full of grain shortages, famine, and appeals for food aid. In Hittite lands, one letter begs the king of Ugarit for grain, because his own fields have failed. In Egypt, inscriptions speak darkly of foreign lands dying of hunger. Add another layer: earthquakes. The eastern Mediterranean sits on a web of active faults. Archaeologists have identified a cluster of destruction layers from Greece to the Levant that show signs consistent with major quakes: walls fallen in the same direction, foundations shifted, buildings pancaked without burning. Some researchers talk about an earthquake storm, a period when tectonic stress releases in a flurry of big events over a few generations. Now stack war and politics on top of climate and geology. The late Bronze Age system is high complexity and high maintenance. Empires like the Hittites and Egyptians rely on long-distance trade to feed cities and supply their armies with bronze weapons and chariots. Vassal states send tribute and troops. Elites expect luxury goods and generous rations. Palaces function as banks, warehouses, and command centers. If drought cuts harvests, states must import grain or face revolt. If earthquakes damage ports and roads, shipments slow. If a war breaks out and an empire spends heavily on chariots and campaigns, margins shrink further. One missed harvest can be managed, 3 or 4 in a row, and the system starts to cannibalize itself. This is where systems collapse theory comes in. Instead of looking for a single smoking gun, it sees the late Bronze Age as a tightly coupled network pushed past its resilience threshold. Climate stress raises food prices. Food stress sparks internal unrest that forces rulers to squeeze their peasants harder, which erodes loyalty. Trade interruptions, whether from pirates, wars, or bankrupt partners, cut off supplies of bronze and prestige goods, weakening armies and undermining elite cohesion. External raiders, seeing weakness strike, and their attacks further disrupt the very trade and agriculture holding everything together. At some point the cascade stops being reversible. Too many palaces burned, too many scribes dead or scattered, too many irrigation systems left to silt up. The Hittite Empire simply disappears. Its capital, Hattusa, is destroyed and abandoned. The intricate political web of Hittite vassals and rivals, the Mitanni, the kingdom of Al-Ashir, city-states across Anatolia and northern Syria, frays, then snaps. For a long stretch afterward, central Anatolia is archaeologically quiet: small villages, scattered pottery, no big palaces or archives. An entire imperial tradition vanishes so thoroughly that later Greeks barely remember it existed. Egypt comes close to sharing that fate. Ramesses III manages to beat off the Sea Peoples on Egypt's borders, at least according to his monuments. But the victory feels Pyrrhic. After his reign, Egyptian power contracts. The state struggles with worker strikes, temple looting, corruption, a chronic shortage of resources. Within a century or two, Egypt has gone from international superpower to a fractured landscape of local rulers, its empire in the Levant gone for good. Mycenaean Greece collapses so hard that later Greeks reinvent their own past as legend. Palatial centres like Pylos, Mycenae and Tiryns burn. Linear bee writing, used by bureaucrats to track rations and taxes, disappears. When literacy reappears centuries later, it uses a completely different script, the alphabetic system borrowed from the Phoenicians. To the people of classical Athens, the great palaces on the hilltops are not administrative complexes. They're the haunted homes of heroes like Agamemnon. Trade networks that once moved metals, glass, ivory and fine ceramics across thousands of kilometers shrink dramatically. In many regions, imported luxury goods vanish from the archaeological record. Pottery styles simplify. Building quality drops. In some places, people literally move back into caves or build modest, easily abandoned houses where grand complexes once stood. For the next few hundred years, large parts of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East live in what historians, for once, don't exaggerate by calling a dark age. Not total darkness. There are survivors, continuity, pockets of resilience. Small kingdoms emerge in the rubble. The early Israelites and Philistines in the Levant, the Neo-Hittite city-states in southern Turkey and northern Syria, the fledgling Phoenician ports that will eventually send ships beyond the Pillars of Hercules. But the scale is different. The administrative literacy of the late Bronze palaces is gone in many areas. Writing becomes rare, sometimes disappearing entirely for generations. Monumental architecture shrinks. International congresses of great kings stop because there are no longer great kings in the old sense, just local players. From the viewpoint of Civilization 3, this is not just a recession. It's an extinction event for a whole way of organizing human life. And that's why, if you're ranking resets by the damage they do to actual functioning civilizations, the Bronze Age collapse is a terrifying contender for first place. No other pre-modern reset we know of so cleanly wipes out an entire interconnected world system. The last time humanity experienced something this sweeping, it was scattered hunter-gatherer groups riding out an ice age or a supervolcanic winter. Now it's palace economies, diplomatic corps, chariot armies, and literate bureaucracies that are going under. The crucial difference, and the only reason this wasn't the end of the civilizational experiment altogether, is that the reset is regional, not global. China is on its own trajectory. Civilizations in the Americas are rising independently. Even within the Eastern Mediterranean, knowledge and traditions survive in fragments, enough embers to rekindle. But for the people who watched palaces burn, who saw archives crumble into dust and trade routes fall silent, it must have felt disturbingly final. Civilization 3 had learned how to build big integrated systems. The Bronze Age collapse was the brutal lesson in how easily those systems can tear, and how long it can take for anything comparable to rise again. Out of that dark age, a different kind of world begins to take shape. It doesn't happen with a single founding hero or a single brilliant invention. It happens in hundreds of small experiments scattered across ruined landscapes. Villages reclaiming abandoned fields, hilltop forts replacing sprawling palaces, local chiefs turning remembered imperial protocols into improvised customs. In Greece, the Mycenaean palaces are gone, but the people aren't. They've moved into smaller, more defensible settlements. Their elites no longer have access to mass bronze production on the old scale, so they lean into something cheaper, and in the long run, more revolutionary: iron. At first, iron is a poor cousin to bronze, harder to work, often inferior in quality. But the key difference is where it comes from. Tin is rare and distant. Iron ore is widespread. As blacksmiths learn to control carbon, to quench and temper, The new metal levels the playing field. You don't need to sit on a trade node between Cyprus and Afghanistan to arm your warriors anymore. An ordinary hill town can, in theory, have swords as good as a king's. That shift quietly undermines the old monopoly of palace economies and paves the way for new political forms. Along the Levantine coast, some of the small survivors of the collapse lean in another direction, the sea. The cities we call Phoenician Tyre, Sidon, Byblos inherit fragments of Canaanite tradition but graft onto them an almost obsessive maritime focus. They experiment relentlessly with shipbuilding, navigation and trade. They rebuild a long-distance network, but this time with lighter infrastructure, merchant houses instead of palaces, trading posts instead of vassal kingdoms. They also streamline writing. The old cuneiform and hieroglyphic systems took years to master and were jealously guarded by scribal elites. The Phoenicians stripped writing down to a compact alphabet, just a couple dozen signs, each standing for a sound. It's optimized for quick note-taking, ship manifests, contracts. When Greek traders encounter this system, they adopt it, tweak it, add vowels. Suddenly, a world that lost literacy in the Dark Age begins to talk to itself again, on clay, on stone, and increasingly on something new, cheap, portable papyrus. Somewhere in this churn of iron tools, alphabetic writing and busy harbours, the fourth civilization coalesces. In the Greek world, small communities organise around new political experiments, the polis, the city-state. With no central palace to dictate orders, citizens argue in assemblies, elect magistrates, and, in a few radical cases like Athens, begin to flirt with the idea that ordinary male citizens, not just kings, can decide public policy. In the Near East, older imperial lineages reassert themselves. The Neo-Assyrian and later Neo-Babylonian empires reinvent large-scale statecraft, standing armies, road systems, provincial governors. In Iran, the Medes, and then the Persians take the imperial toolkit and supersize it. Under Cyrus and Darius, the Achaemenid Empire becomes the largest political structure the world has yet seen, royal roads stitching together Egypt, Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and beyond, standardized coinage and measurements, trying to make sense of dozens of languages and cultures under one crown. This is not a simple story of East versus West, it's a dense web of borrowings and improvisations. Greek hoplites don helmets and cuirasses that owe something to Near Eastern metalwork. Persian administrators pick up tricks from older Mesopotamian scribes. Phoenician traders carry ideas as casually as they carry tin and dye, alphabetic scripts to distant shores, artistic motifs, religious symbols. Carthage, a Phoenician offshoot in North Africa, becomes a maritime power in its own right, exporting both goods and a distinctive political model of oligarchic councils and mercenary armies. What's different this time is not just the scale of states, but the scale of reflection. Out of the city-states and imperial courts comes something new in intensity, philosophy. In Ionian ports, thinkers like Thales and Anaximander start asking what the world is made of, not in terms of gods and monsters, but in terms of elements and processes. In Athens, Socrates, Plato and Aristotle turn that questioning inward. What is justice? What is the best form of government? What does it mean to live well? In India and China, on broadly parallel timelines, the Upanishadic sages, the Buddha, Confucius, and Laozi, ask their own versions of the same questions. Engineering takes a leap too. Greek architects play with proportion and load-bearing stone to raise temples and theatres that still stand millennia later. Hellenistic inventors experiment with gears, screws, and steam toys. Persian and later Roman engineers drive roads, bridges, tunnels, qanats, and aqueducts across continents. learning how to move water, armies, and information with uncanny efficiency. All of this rests on memory, often half mythologized, of what came before. Greek epics like the Iliad and Odyssey are, among other things, distant echoes of a Bronze Age world reimagined. Great kings, siege warfare, heroes from crumbling palaces now recast as semi-divine figures. Law codes from Mesopotamia look back to even older precedents. Roman elites model their senate and republican virtues partly on their own legends, partly on selective readings of Greek practice, which was itself a response to earlier tyrannies and aristocracies. The fourth civilization is, in a real sense, a hyper-self-conscious rebuild. It remembers collapse, not clearly, not scientifically, but viscerally. It tells itself stories about hubris and nemesis, about cities punished by gods, about cycles of rise and fall. Tragedy as an art form is born in this context, and yet, despite all those cautionary tales, the same basic pattern reasserts itself. Connectivity breeds both strength and fragility. By the time Rome has muscled its way into dominance around the Mediterranean, the classical world is an intricate mesh of trade routes and political dependencies. Grain from Egypt feeds Rome, silver from Spain underwrites coinage, timber from the Balkans builds fleets, silk from far-off China, funneled through Parthian middlemen, ends up in Roman wardrobes. A bad harvest in one province can now ripple across an empire. A disrupted sea lane, a bandit-ridden mountain pass, a new invading confederation on a distant frontier. These aren't local issues anymore. They're system-wide stressors, and the smaller alarms are already ringing. Plagues move along the same roads that carry merchants and messengers. Local epidemics become regional crises. Invasions by Cimmerians, Scythians, Celts, or Germanic tribes periodically slam into the settled zones, testing walls and armies. Cities burn, then are rebuilt. Civil wars convulse states from Athens to Persia to Rome, as ambitious generals discover that controlling a professional army is a faster route to power than climbing any civic ladder. Each time the system absorbs the blow. Each time it rebuilds, sometimes stronger, sometimes more centralized, sometimes more brittle. From a distance, the classical world, Greece, Persia, Rome, Carthage, the Hellenistic kingdoms, looks like an apex. Philosophers debating metaphysics, engineers spanning valleys with stone, senators arguing over law, markets humming in dozens of ports. Compared to the shattered landscape after 1200 BCE, it feels like proof that Civilization III's mistakes have been corrected. But under the marble and rhetoric, the same old dynamics are coiling: ecological strain, overextension, inequality, disease, and the gamble that complexity itself will keep holding everything together. It won't. The fourth civilization is about to collide with a new sequence of shocks, some climatic, some biological, some purely human, that will topple emperors, depopulate cities, and mark the end of the classical experiment. The next reset is already on the way. The first act of that reset is slow and political. It starts long before anyone notices the sky dimming. By the late 300s and 400s CE, the Roman world is already fraying. The empire has been split administratively into east and west. Tax systems are creaking under the weight of a professional army and an elaborate bureaucracy. Landed elites are hoarding wealth while small farmers slide into debt and dependency. Emperors rise and fall in quick succession, often made and unmade by their own troops. And on the frontiers, pressure is building. Groups we call Goths, Vandals, Huns, Franks and others are not just barbarians at the gates. They're confederations in motion, pushed and pulled by their own internal politics and by climate stresses further north and east. When they cross the imperial borders, sometimes as invaders, sometimes as refugees begging for land, Rome's overextended system has no good answers. The sack of Rome in 410, the loss of North Africa to the Vandals in 439, the final deposition of the last Western emperor in 476. These are dramatic moments, but they're not a clean break with civilization. The Eastern Empire survives in Constantinople. Roman law, Roman Christianity, Roman ideas linger in new barbarian kingdoms from Italy to Gaul. If history had stopped its cruelty there, we might talk about a messy transition, not a reset. But then the planet itself joins the war. In the 530s, something happens in the sky. Or rather, several somethings. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica show abrupt spikes in volcanic sulfate around 536 and again in 504. Tree rings from Europe and Asia narrow sharply, recording years of stunted growth. Contemporary writers grope for language. Procopius, a court historian in Constantinople, describes the sun as giving forth its light without brightness, like the moon for nearly a year. Others talk about a year without summer, crop failures, strange atmospheric veils. We now think this cluster of eruptions, possibly including a massive tropical volcano, kicked off what climatologists call the late antique Little Ice Age, a several-decade period of cooler, more variable climate, starting around 536 CE. Cooler doesn't sound apocalyptic until you remember how tightly pre-industrial societies are coupled to the growing season. Shortened summers and erratic rains mean failed harvests. Failed harvests mean grain shortages, rising prices, weakened bodies. Weakened bodies are exactly what a new killer pathogen is waiting for. In 541, the plague arrives. It probably emerges somewhere along the trade routes of East Africa or Central Asia, then rides the same ships and caravans that once moved silk and spices into the heart of the Mediterranean world. In the bustling port of Pelusium in Egypt, people start dying. Then Alexandria, then Constantinople. This is the plague of Justinian, named after the Eastern Roman emperor who happens to be ruling when it hits. Modern genetic work on ancient DNA shows it was caused by Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium behind the Black Death 8 centuries later. Contemporary sources struggle to count the dead. Some claim 10,000 per day in Constantinople at the peak. Those numbers are probably exaggerated, but even conservative estimates suggest mortality rates of 30 to 50% in many urban centres, with repeated waves over 2 centuries. Now imagine what that means for an empire already straining. Tax rolls collapse as taxpayers die or flee. Armies shrink, not just from battlefield losses, but from disease in the barracks. Skilled artisans, scribes, shipwrights, engineers, the human infrastructure of complexity vanish in droves. Fields go untilled because there aren't enough hands. Urban grain doles, already stressed by bad harvests, become impossible to maintain. And remember, all of this is happening while the climate is still misbehaving. Cooler, more unstable weather continues into the 6th and 7th centuries. In some regions, this means repeated crop failures and famine. In others, it shifts rainfall patterns, disrupting traditional agriculture and pastoral routes. The famous barbarian invasions of earlier centuries start to look, in part, like climate-driven migrations layered onto political opportunity. The result is not a single dramatic crash like a meteor impact. It's a grinding multi-front attrition. Cities across the former Western Empire shrink or are abandoned outright. Urban life in Britain, for example, nearly evaporates. The grand stone architecture of Roman Gaul and Spain decays as maintenance budgets disappear. Long-distance trade networks fragment, where amphorae full of olive oil and wine once crisscrossed the Mediterranean in bulk. Local production and local consumption dominate. Administratively too, the old unity cracks in the East. Justinian's ambitious campaigns to reconquer Italy and North Africa briefly stitch parts of the Roman world back together, but they come at a staggering cost. Tax hikes, conscription, and the diversion of resources weaken the core just as plague bites deepest. After Justinian, the Eastern Empire survives, but it is narrower, poorer, and increasingly Greek-speaking rather than Latin. In the West, successor kingdoms, Visigothic, Ostrogothic, Frankish, Lombard, pick up bits of Roman tradition but do so unevenly. Law codes get localized, coinage becomes cruder or disappears. Literacy retreats into church and monastery. The idea of a single integrated Mediterranean Roman lake gives way to a patchwork of regional powers. Compared to the earlier resets we've looked at, this one is different in structure. The Younger Dryas was essentially a climate punch. The Great Bronze Age collapse, whatever mix of causes it had, still feels like a relatively tight cluster in time. The fifth reset is sprawling and entangled. Volcanic aerosols dim the sun. Climate cools and destabilizes. Famine weakens populations. Plague scythes through them. Political systems, already stressed by inequality and overextension, fail to coordinate an effective response. Each crisis amplifies the others. It's a systems failure, not a single blow. And yet, as with every previous reset, something endures. Roman law, Christian institutions, fragments of classical learning. They survive, but in a smaller, rougher world. Population densities crash in many regions, but they do not hit the absolute floor they reached in earlier prehistoric bottlenecks. Civilization 5 will grow out of this narrowed base, more rural, more localized, more overtly religious in its self-understanding, but carrying forward enough of the old to make the next rebuild possible. First, though, humanity has to learn how to live in a world where empire has cracked, the climate has turned against them, and the deadliest microbes they've ever seen are now part of the landscape. Civilization 5 doesn't begin with a proclamation. It begins with people quietly refusing to die. In the ruins of the Western Empire, peasants keep planting grain in half-abandoned villas. Bishops copy legal formulas into church records because someone still needs contracts and wills. In the East, scribes in Constantinople keep updating law codes, even as city populations fall and whole neighborhoods empty out. It doesn't feel like a new civilization. It feels like salvage. But over a few hundred years, the pattern shifts. The people who grew up never knowing a united Roman world start building something different. In Western Europe, political power recenters on landholding warriors rather than salaried bureaucrats. Instead of imperial provinces, you get kingdoms stitched together by oaths and marriages, Frankish, Lombard, Anglo-Saxon. Literacy, instead of flowing through imperial schools, runs mostly through monasteries. Monks and nuns become information storage devices, preserving not just religious texts but medical treatises, farming manuals and fragments of Greek philosophy. It's easy to label this a dark age, but in many regions it's more like a slow, uneven reboot. Agricultural techniques adapt to cooler, wetter climates. New plough designs and crop rotations gradually push yields back up. Forests that reclaimed former Roman fields are cut again. Population, after centuries of volatility, starts creeping upward. Meanwhile, south and east of the Mediterranean, a different trajectory is unfolding. Out of the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century, a new religious and political force emerges: Islam. Within a few generations, Islamic polities control former Roman territories in the Levant, Egypt, North Africa and beyond, as well as vast stretches of Persia and Central Asia. They inherit not just cities and roads, but libraries, scholars and tax systems. Where one complex system has fractured, another coheres. In Abbasid Baghdad, in Umayyad Cordoba, in cities from Cairo to Bukhara, a deliberate project of knowledge synthesis takes shape. Greek philosophy, Indian mathematics, Persian medicine, and local practical know-how are translated, debated, and expanded. Algebra, algorithms, the very numerals you use today, these are refined or formalized in this Islamic golden age. Hospitals, observatories, paper mills, institutions of learning and administration reappear at scale. Farther east in China, yet another thread of Civilization 5 is weaving itself. After its own cycles of unity and fragmentation, the Tang and Song dynasties preside over a world of bustling cities, bureaucratic exams, gunpowder experiments, porcelain manufacture, and intensive rice agriculture. China's population swells into the tens of millions. Paper money, canal systems, and sophisticated iron production point to a level of economic complexity that in some ways surpasses anything Rome ever achieved. These aren't isolated stories, they're increasingly linked. Across Eurasia, trade networks thicken back into existence. The Silk Road and its many branches connect China, Central Asia, the Islamic world, and indirectly Europe. Caravans carry silk, spices, furs, glassware, precious metals, and just as importantly, ideas and techniques. Sea routes in the Indian Ocean knit together East Africa, Arabia, India, Southeast Asia, and China in seasonal monsoon circuits. By around 900–1200 CE, something remarkable is happening. Population is climbing across much of Eurasia. Part of this is technological and political, but part of it is environmental. Climatologists call it the medieval climate optimum, a roughly 300-year interval, especially in the North Atlantic and parts of Europe, where conditions were slightly warmer and in many regions more stable than during the late antique Little Ice Age. Longer growing seasons in Europe, relatively favourable conditions in parts of China and the Near East. Nothing dramatic compared to glacial cycles, but enough to matter for pre-industrial agriculture. Better harvests support more people support more specialisation, merchants, craftsmen, scholars, clergy, soldiers, administrators. Towns that had shrunk in late antiquity begin to swell again. New urban centres, Flanders, northern Italian communes, Islamic trading ports, Song Chinese river cities surge with markets and workshops. From one angle, this looks like resilience paying off. Humanity has endured climate shocks, plague and political fragmentation, and now complexity is back. Cities, universities, long-distance trade, standardized laws. From another angle, it's a trap being slowly baited. Dense urban centres mean thousands of people packed into tight quarters, often with poor sanitation and close contact with domesticated animals. Granaries and warehouses stockpile food, attracting rats and their fleas. Seasonal migrant labourers and pilgrims move in and out of these cities, carrying whatever microbes they pick up. Long-distance trade, the great engine of cross-civilizational exchange, is also the perfect highway system for pathogens. A merchant ship leaving a Black Sea port doesn't just carry grain and cloth, it carries stowaway rodents. A caravan from Central Asia doesn't just bring horses and silks, it brings the microbiomes of every oasis and marketplace along its route. The very interconnection that makes Civilization 5 so dynamic, goods, ideas, people moving faster and farther than at any time since Rome, is quietly knitting the world into a single epidemiological web. When climate is cooperative and disease is background noise, that web is an advantage. Surpluses can be shifted, famine can sometimes be relieved by imports, local disasters can be buffered by distant allies. But it also means that when a truly efficient killer emerges in one corner of the network, it won't stay a local problem for long. By the early 14th century, that network is in place. Populations in Europe, the Islamic world, and much of Asia have reached new highs. Cities are crowded, Trade routes from the Mediterranean to China and from the Indian Ocean to the Baltic are humming. Civilization 5 has rebuilt itself into something bigger, more interconnected, and in many ways more sophisticated than the Roman world that fell. It has also unknowingly prepared the stage for the most infamous pandemic in recorded history. It probably began, as most world-shattering things do, with something tiny and invisible hitching a ride. Somewhere in Central Asia, in the early 1300s, a bacterium that normally lived in wild rodent populations found its way into a new ecological experiment, the densely woven trade networks of Civilization 5. Yersinia pestis had caused epidemics before. The so-called Justinianic plague in the 6th century is a strong candidate, but this time the conditions were different. Populations were higher, cities were bigger, trade routes, both overland and sea, were thicker and faster than ever. The Silk Road didn't just connect oases and caravanserais from China to the Mediterranean, it connected their rat populations. Fleas feeding on infected rodents in one dusty Central Asian town could, via a cascade of caravan stops and grain warehouses, end up in the hold of a ship in the Black Sea. By the 1330s, written records from China and Central Asia speak of strange pestilences, of whole communities collapsing, of trade disrupted not by bandits but by corpses. As caravans moved westward, so did the disease. It followed the logic of Civilization 5's success. Where goods were dense and people gathered, the plague would follow. In 1346, it reached the Black Sea ports, like Kaffa in Crimea, keynodes linking overland Silk Road routes to Mediterranean shipping. From there, it boarded Italian merchant vessels, hidden in sacks of grain, in bales of cloth, in swarms of fleas clinging to black rats. In 1347, those ships began arriving in Mediterranean harbours, Messina, Genoa, Marseille. The disease stepped off with them. What followed is one of the most brutal demographic collapses in human history. Across Eurasia and North Africa, the Black Death burned through communities with astonishing speed. In many European regions, contemporary accounts and later demographic reconstructions converge on a rough, terrifying number, something like a third to half of the population dead within a few years. Some cities seem to have lost even more. In parts of Italy, estimates run as high as 60%. Entire villages vanish from tax records. Fields go untilled because there is simply no one left to work them. The Islamic world was hit just as hard. Cairo, Damascus, Aleppo, major urban centres with sophisticated medical traditions suffer catastrophic losses. Chronicles speak of funerals performed in bulk, of graveyards expanding like new suburbs. North African regions report entire lineages extinguished, scholarly networks shattered. In Persia and Central Asia, already weakened by Mongol invasions and environmental strain, the plague compounds chaos. In some areas, social structures simply disintegrate. China's picture is harder to reconstruct in detail, but the Yuan dynasty faces a series of famines, uprisings, and epidemics in the 14th century that collectively carved tens of millions off the population. Whether every death was due to Yersinia pestis or to its ripple effects, famine, war, secondary disease, the end result is similar, a steep, sustained decline. This isn't a gentle correction, it's a guillotine. In village after village, there aren't enough living people to bury the dead. Priests, imams, monks, doctors, midwives, the very people meant to hold communities together die at the same or higher rates than anyone else, because they're the ones tending to the sick. Legal systems falter because there aren't enough scribes to record contracts, or enough magistrates to enforce them. Trade caravans stop not just because of quarantine, but because there's no one left to load the camels. In parts of Europe, basic social rules start to fray. Some elites retreat to country estates, shutting their gates, hoping wealth can insulate them from microbes. Others die in their city palaces just like everyone else. Peasants, suddenly scarce, can walk away from oppressive landlords. Labourers demand higher wages. In England, this will eventually help trigger the peasants' revolt. In other regions, local lords respond with repression to try and pin the social order back in place. Religious faith, the primary interpretive framework for most people, goes through its own convulsions. Some communities turn toward extreme piety. Flagellant movements in Europe march from town to town, whipping themselves, begging God to lift the punishment. Others turn towards scapegoats. Jewish communities, already marginalized, are blamed in many European cities. Accusations of well poisoning lead to massacres and expulsions. In parts of the Islamic world, scholars debate the theological meaning of a plague that kills the pious and impious alike. The Black Death doesn't just kill bodies, it kills confidence. For a moment, in some regions, it looks like the entire machinery of Civilization 5 might seize up. If you stand in a French village whose population has just been cut in half, or in a Syrian city where the great teachers of law and medicine are dead, or in a Chinese district where fields lie fallow and bandits roam, the idea of civilization feels like the memory of a dream. And yet, as with previous resets, the collapse is uneven. Some areas are hammered, others, for reasons we still don't fully understand, local ecology, social practices, sheer luck, suffer less and become demographic reservoirs. Rural regions sometimes fare better than crowded cities. Places a little off the main trade arteries can be spared the first worst waves. That patchiness matters. It stops the Black Death from becoming truly global in the 14th century. Sub-Saharan Africa is mostly bypassed. The Americas are, at this point, outside the Old World epidemiological web. But for the interconnected Afro-Eurasian core, this is as close as the pre-modern world comes to a near-total wipeout. When historians talk about the Black Death, they often emphasize the long-term shifts. It helped catalyze labour shortages pushing wages up in Europe, weakening feudal bonds, fiscal strains on states, prompting new forms of taxation and administration, intellectual shakenings that, some argue, help set the stage for Renaissance and Reformation. In the logic of our story, those are the features of a reset. Civilization 5 doesn't end in 1350, but it emerges from the Black Death changed, its population sharply reduced, its social contracts renegotiated, its religious and intellectual life jolted into new trajectories. Trade routes reconfigure. Land use patterns shift. Entire towns never recover. Others left standing become new centres because competitors vanished. The sixth reset isn't an asteroid impact or a supervolcano. It's a microbe using the very success of human interconnection as its vehicle. And it's the last time, before the modern era, that the complexity of a globalizing civilization comes perilously close to tearing itself apart under the strain. The question now is, if a bacterium could do that to a mostly agrarian, low-energy world, what happens when resets collide with an industrial one? Civilization 6 is born in the shadow of all that death. If you're a survivor in Europe in, say, 1400, the world feels strangely roomy. There is land to be had. Wages, if you're a labourer, are better than your grandparents could have imagined. Guilds are weakened, noble lineages have blinked out, monasteries sit half empty. The old equilibrium population, pressing constantly against the ceiling of available resources, has been smashed. On the surface, this is devastation. Underneath, it's a release of pressure. In Western Europe especially, that release combines with something else, a creeping willingness to question authority. The plague has made a mockery of learned doctors and holy men. If the best explanations of the day couldn't predict or prevent the horror that just happened, maybe they're not the last word on reality. So over the 1400s and 1500s, you see the outlines of Civilization 6 taking shape. City-states like Florence, Venice, and later the Dutch Republic become laboratories for a new kind of thinking. Banking, double-entry bookkeeping, long-distance finance. These aren't glamorous, but they allow resources to be shifted in ways no medieval baron could have managed. Patronage systems funnel the surplus of merchants and princes into art, architecture, and crucially, curiosity. People begin to take ancient Greek and Roman texts seriously again. But they also start doing something more radical, checking ideas against experience. The Renaissance isn't a sudden leap into modern science, but it is a pivot. Artists experiment with perspective, anatomists dissect human bodies despite church discomfort, navigators refine maps, not because Aristotle said so, but because last voyage's coastline was a little farther north than expected. The world becomes an object of investigation, not just contemplation. And then Europe looks up from its plague scars and asks a very dangerous question. What lies beyond the horizon? The answers, beginning with 1492, are spectacular and horrifying in equal measure. When Columbus and the fleets that follow cross the Atlantic, they don't just bring steel, horses and gunpowder. They bring, once again, civilization's most lethal export, disease, smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, pathogens that old world populations had been co-evolving with for millennia, hit the Americas like a slow-motion asteroid. Indigenous peoples had their own sophisticated societies, trade networks, agricultural systems, and, in some regions, urban civilizations. What they did not have was prior exposure to these particular microbes. The result is one of the greatest demographic collapses in human history, rivaling or exceeding the Black Death in sheer proportional loss. In many parts of the Americas, estimates suggest populations fall by 80 to 90% within a century or two of first sustained contact. It doesn't happen overnight. There are waves, a smallpox epidemic here, a measles outbreak there, famine and social breakdown in their wake. Empires like the Aztec and Inca fall, not just because of Spanish steel and alliances, but because disease decapitates leadership, shatters armies and unravels the social fabric from the inside. This is a reset that doesn't look like a single neatly dated catastrophe from the outside. It's a rolling region-by-region implosion of entire worlds. Forests regrow where fields once stood. Terraces collapse. Oral traditions are broken because entire lineages vanish before they can pass them on. Even the global climate may have felt the impact. Some researchers argue that reforestation on abandoned American farmlands contributed to a small dip in atmospheric CO2, nudging the Little Ice Age a bit colder. Civilization 6 is already global in a way no prior civilization has been. Silver from Potosi fuels Spanish Empire and flows to China. Sugar from Caribbean plantations sweetens European tables and drives the transatlantic slave trade. Spices, furs, slaves, textiles, porcelain, all moving in widening loops around the planet. But the truly radical break is still ahead. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, in a cluster of damp islands off the coast of Europe, humans figure out how to turn ancient sunlight, fossil fuels into mechanical work at scale. The Industrial Revolution isn't just better tools. It's a new energy regime. Coal, and later oil, allow a tiny fraction of the population to command more horsepower than all previous civilizations combined. Steam engines pull trains, pump mines, power factories. Textile mills turn raw cotton into cloth with a speed that obliterates traditional handicraft industries. Iron and then steel railways stitch continents together. Telegraph wires let a message outrun a horse for the first time in history. Population, which had recovered slowly and unevenly from the Black Death, now rockets upward. Life expectancy begins to inch higher as sanitation improves and food supplies stabilize for some. Cities explode in size. In 1800, only a few % of humans live in cities. By 1900, industrial metropolises with millions of inhabitants are normal. Interconnection becomes totalizing. Grain from the American Midwest feeds workers in Manchester. Rubber from the Congo moves European bicycles and soon cars. A locust swarm in India or a failed Nile flood can now show up as a price spike on a London exchange. With that interconnection come brand new ways to break. Global empires mean that war is no longer a mostly regional affair. Industrial capacity turns conflict into slaughter on a scale unimaginable to medieval generals. World War I's trenches and poison gas. World War II's firebombed cities and eventually nuclear weapons. These are the offspring of Civilization VI's energy revolution. Pandemics too get an upgrade. Steamships and later airplanes compress travel times, letting diseases traverse oceans in days, not months. The 1918 influenza pandemic, moving along troop transports and civilian routes, kills tens of millions in a matter of months. For the first time, we see what a truly industrial era disease can do. Synchronized global shock. And yet alongside these new risks, Civilization VI invents tools that will define our seventh: modern science, public health, industrial agriculture, fossil fuel-driven climate change, and the information systems that will eventually circle the planet as satellites and fiber optic cables. By the early 20th century, humanity has assembled something qualitatively new: a single, tightly coupled, high-energy, global civilization. That's the one we live in now, our Civilization VII. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If earlier resets could hollow out continents with nothing more than fleas, or viruses hitching rides on wooden ships, what happens when catastrophe hits a world armed with nuclear weapons, global just-in-time supply chains, and a climate system we're actively destabilizing? Before we can answer that, we have to step back. All along, we've been treating the Black Death, the floods, the collapses as major shocks. But were they really the worst the planet has thrown at us? To find out, we have to go deeper in time, to an eruption so vast it almost didn't leave anyone behind to tell the tale. About 74,000 years ago, on the island of Sumatra, the planet almost tried again, not with an asteroid. With a volcano, where Lake Toba sits today, there used to be a mountain. Then that mountain blew itself apart in one of the largest eruptions any hominin has ever lived through. We're not talking about something on the scale of Mount St. Helens or even Krakatoa. Toba ejected thousands of times more material than those historic eruptions combined. Ash spread over much of South Asia, Indian Ocean cores show layers centimeters thick, and sulfur aerosols were blasted high into the stratosphere. This is where the volcanic winter hypothesis comes in. Imagine, for a moment, you're one of those anatomically modern humans we met earlier, small bands scattered across Africa and by this point beginning to edge out into the broader old world. You hunt, you gather, you read subtle seasonal cues the way we read smartphone screens. Then the sky changes. Stratospheric aerosols from Toba's eruption reflect sunlight. Global temperatures drop, some models say by several degrees. Growing seasons shrink. Monsoons weaken or shift. It doesn't have to be instant apocalyptic darkness to be lethal. If you live close to the edge, if your food supply already depends on the narrow margin between enough rain and not quite, a few bad years in a row can be the difference between a thriving band and a vanished lineage. For decades, Toba was the prime suspect in a mystery geneticists had uncovered. why modern humans seem to carry the signature of a severe population bottleneck sometime between roughly 50,000 and 100,000 years ago. Look at our DNA, and you don't see the kind of deep, branching diversity you'd expect if we'd always maintained big, stable populations scattered over multiple continents. Instead, you see patterns that, when plugged into population models, look a lot like what you'd get if our numbers had crashed at some point to, at most, a few thousand breeding individuals. Some analyses have suggested effective population sizes as low as 1 or 2,000. If you're searching the Pleistocene record for a plausible hammer big enough to do that, Toba practically jumps off the page. The early version of the Toba bottleneck story went like this. Super-eruption happens, volcanic winter sets in, ecosystems crash. Early Homo sapiens, already rare and vulnerable, are hammered down to a tiny remnant. Those survivors, through sheer luck and adaptability, become the ancestors of everyone alive today. In that framing, Toba is the closest we've ever come to total erasure. But then archaeologists started poking holes in the neat narrative. In India, right under and right above the Toba ash layer, you find stone tools that look continuous. Same basic technology, same style. In some African sites, there's no obvious break in human presence around 74,000 years ago. People are still napping, still hunting, still using pigments and ornaments. If Toba nearly killed us, why don't we see more gaps? Climate proxies, too, are messier than the original catastrophe models suggested. Yes, Toba coincides with cooling, but it also sits inside a glacial period that already had its own ups and downs. Some ice core records show a blip, others are less dramatic. More recent climate simulations suggest a significant, but perhaps regionally variable cooling, not a planet plunged into a decade-long nuclear winter. And genetics, that original smoking gun, has gone through its own reinterpretation. As we've added more genomes from more regions, more ancient DNA, more comparison with Neanderthals and Denisovans, the picture has gotten richer and weirder. The bottleneck signal is real, but it may not map cleanly onto a single eruption. It might reflect long periods of low population size, structured metapopulations, expansions and contractions over tens of thousands of years, not one sharp cliff. Some researchers now argue that Toba was a serious blow in some regions, barely a hiccup in others. That it stressed populations already living dangerously close to the edge, but didn't come within a hair's breadth of wiping us out globally. From that angle, Toba becomes one more nasty spike in an already volatile ice age, not the decisive near-fatal reset. So which is it? Was Toba the gun to humanity's head, or just another bullet whizzing past? To answer that, it helps to line it up against the other resets we've been talking about. The Younger Dryas? Brutal climate whiplash? Yes. But by then, humans were spread across multiple continents, with a variety of subsistence strategies. Regional collapses, not global near-extinction. The Bronze Age collapse. A network failure within a specific band of interconnected kingdoms around the eastern Mediterranean. Catastrophic for them, barely noticed by hunter-gatherers in Siberia or farmers in the Yellow River Valley. Even the Black Death, which killed something like a third to half of Europe and big chunks of Asia and North Africa, never truly endangered the species. Horrific mortality, but from a starting population in the hundreds of millions. Toba is different in one crucial way: timing. When it blew, our entire species was still in its early fragile phase. We were not yet a planet-spanning superorganism with billions of redundant nodes. We were, at best, hundreds of thousands of scattered hunter-gatherers, maybe fewer. Hit a system like that with a severe multi-year climate shock, and you don't need global darkness to flirt with oblivion. You just need enough failed rainy seasons in enough key refuges at the same time. Whether or not Toba literally drove us down to a few thousand survivors, it is almost certainly the largest single geologic punch thrown at Homo sapiens, while we were still small enough to be knocked out cold. In that sense, it remains our strongest contender for came closest to ending us for good. And that's the uncomfortable part. Because Toba is a reminder that even without cities, without fossil fuels, without nuclear arsenals, our species has already walked along the edge of the cliff more than once. The difference now isn't that the risks are new, it's that for the first time one of the biggest supervolcanoes we have to worry about might be us. So here we are, Civilization 7, 8 billion descendants of those scattered hunter-gatherers wrapped in a single humming planetary machine. If you zoom out, what we've built in the last few centuries doesn't look like just another empire or just another culture. It looks like a new phase change in how humans exist on Earth. For the first time, almost every human alive is plugged into variations of the same system. The same fossil fuel energy web, the same globalized food chains, the same information networks, the same pathogens, hitchhiking on the same planes and cargo ships. And the scale of it is absurd. There are more people alive right now than in all of previous human history combined. We burn in a single year more energy than all pre-industrial civilizations used across thousands of years. Our satellites rim the planet. Our data centers quietly inhale rivers of electricity, and our supply chains loop from Brazilian soy fields to Chinese factories to American warehouses and back again. On the surface, this looks like peak resilience. We can move grain across oceans in days. We can reroute flights when a volcano erupts. A factory fire in one country is covered by production in another. If a hurricane destroys crops in one region, global markets reshuffle food flows in response. The whole thing feels redundant, flexible, efficient. But that efficiency comes with a catch. Unlike those old metapopulations of small scattered bands, our modern civilization is tightly coupled. The same just-in-time logistics that keep costs down also keep buffers thin. The same centralization that gives us powerful tools also concentrates risk. Pull on the wrong thread, and you don't just inconvenience a few million people. You jolt the entire system. We've had glimpses of this. A virus jumps from animals to humans sometime around 1918. Within months, the so-called Spanish flu is burning through armies, cities, remote villages. Somewhere between 50 and 100 million people die in a world that's only about 2 billion strong. No single city falls permanently, no empire vanishes forever. But you can see how fast a pathogen can ride our transport networks, how invisible the early stages of a global shock can be. Fast forward a century, another zoonotic virus. This time we watch in real time as flights spread it across continents. Within weeks, hospitals are overwhelmed, borders close, entire economies slam on the brakes, shelves empty. Suddenly, we all learn what supply chain actually means. COVID-19 was not an extinction event. It wasn't even in the same mortality league as the Black Death proportionally. But it was a live fire systems test. It showed how tightly synchronized we are. A microscopic piece of RNA in one city can, in months, disrupt the lives of billions. Pandemics are only one kind of near miss. In October 1962, Soviet missiles in Cuba, American blockades, nervous pilots, misread radar screens, humanity stands a handful of decisions away from thermonuclear war. Later in 1983, a Soviet early warning system mistakes sunlight glinting off clouds for incoming American missiles. The officer on duty, Stanislav Petrov, decides it's a false alarm and does not pass the alert up the chain. Nothing happens, which is exactly the point. Multiple times in the second half of the 20th century, The difference between continued history and cities vaporized in minutes came down to a few people keeping their nerve when machines told them the end had arrived. In a world with thousands of nuclear warheads, this is a different kind of reset candidate than anything we've seen before. Not a slow grind of famine, not centuries of invading nomads and crumbling aqueducts. A 20-minute window between normal day and global cascade of collapses that no one can fully model. Then there are the quieter crises. Oil shocks in the 1970s ripple through economies worldwide. A financial product melts down in 2008, and suddenly factories, shipping companies, and entire governments are wondering if the credit that oils the global machine is about to seize up. A cargo ship wedges itself in the Suez Canal, and the world briefly discovers just how many things depend on that single artery staying open. Each of these episodes chips away at the illusion that modern automatically equals safe. And yet, compared to any previous civilization, our toolkit for resilience is extraordinary. We can sequence a novel virus in days and start designing vaccines in weeks. We can track storms from space and evacuate entire coastlines before impact. We can beam knowledge across the planet at the speed of light. A farmer with a smartphone in rural Africa now has access to weather forecasts and market prices that emperors could only dream about. Science gives us models of climate, of epidemics, of ecosystem thresholds. Medicine gives us antibiotics, antivirals, intensive care, public health protocols. Communication networks let governments, labs, and ordinary people coordinate in ways completely unavailable to medieval city-states or Bronze Age kingdoms. If a crop fails in one region, it can be replaced from another hemisphere. If a power plant goes offline, grids can reroute electricity. If one company folds, others can absorb production. On paper, this looks like a civilization wrapped in safety nets. But those nets rest on a common assumption that the underlying global system stays basically intact. We can absorb regional hurricanes, local earthquakes, seasonal epidemics. Our redundancy is lateral, across space, not vertical, down through time. We're good at moving things around a functioning world. We're less practiced at rebuilding the world itself if core pieces break. Which is where the stakes of Civilization 7 really diverge from everything that came before. When Rome fell, people still farmed the same river valleys. When plague hit medieval Europe, other continents continued more or less on their own trajectories. Even the Younger Dryas and Toba played out in a world of relatively small, dispersed populations. There was always somewhere else unburned, some lineage unbroken, some culture untouched enough to carry the flame forward. Today, there is no somewhere else beyond the system. Every continent is wired into the same climate, the same oceans, the same financial networks, the same industrial base. A sufficiently large disruption to the atmosphere, to food production, to nuclear peace, to digital infrastructure, doesn't just knock down one civilization among many. It risks knocking down the only truly global civilization humans have ever constructed. That doesn't mean one crisis will automatically erase us. Homo sapiens is stubborn. We survived ice age swings, supervolcanos and pathogens without vaccines. Small bands of humans are very good at making it through bad times. But the scale of potential loss has never been higher. A reset today, if it tore through the systems we depend on, wouldn't just wipe out a city like Uruk or an empire like Rome. It could remove most of the technological, scientific and organizational scaffolding that took us from fire-making apes to a species debating Mars colonies. The question we have to ask, when we line up all these resets from the Younger Dryas to Toba to the Black Death to the nuclear age, isn't just how bad were they? It's how close did they come to collapsing the human experiment beyond easy recovery? Because to rank them, To really decide which reset came closest to ending us for good, we have to hold them up against the thing we're standing inside right now. Civilization. 7. More powerful than anything that came before it, more interconnected than any previous world, and, in some very uncomfortable ways, more fragile. So which hammer in our history actually hit closest to the kill switch? To find out, we need to put all 6 past resets on the same scale, and then unavoidably compare them to the risks we've created for ourselves. To rank the resets, we need a scoreboard, not of dates and names, but of damage. 4 questions matter. First, how many people did we lose? Call it demographic impact. If you knock the human population down far enough, random bad luck starts to matter more than adaptation. You can get stuck in evolutionary dead ends or just vanish. Second, how much knowledge and culture burned. Population can rebound in a few generations. Lost skills, lost languages, lost technologies. That's harder. It changes the slope of the recovery curve. Third, how long did it take to claw back? A short, brutal hit that people bounce from in a century is different from a slow grind that holds humanity in a lower complexity state for thousands of years. And fourth, how wide was the blast radius? Was this a regional horror story that one part of the world barely noticed? Or did it reach into every ecosystem that humans depended on? With those criteria in mind, let's line up the usual suspects. Start with the Black Death. Demographic impact, obscene. In some parts of Europe, maybe half the people died. Globally, perhaps a third of the population. Whole villages abandoned. Mass graves. Psychological trauma so deep it rewrote religion, art, and politics. Cultural loss? Locally, huge monasteries that guarded manuscripts were wiped out. Skilled artisans vanished. But globally, the human knowledge base didn't reset to zero. China, the Islamic world, India, each had their own plagues and crises, but no synchronized collapse. Recovery time? A few centuries. By 1500, Europe's population was climbing again. By 1600, you see scientific revolutions taking shape. The plague delayed some trajectories, accelerated others, but it didn't smash the foundation. Geographic scope? Afro-Eurasian, yes. But the Americas, Australia, much of sub-Saharan Africa were outside the direct blast. Other branches of the human experiment kept going. By our scoreboard, the Black Death was brutally lethal, but not existential. Civilization. 5 took a body blow and kept walking. Moved back to the late antique crisis, the fall of Rome and the little ice age that wrapped around it. Population loss, significant in some provinces, but not a species-level crash. Urban centres shrank, rural populations shifted. People moved rather than disappeared. Cultural loss. In Western Europe, severe. Literacy rates dropped. Road networks decayed. Techniques for concrete, large-scale engineering, complex taxation systems, all fragmented. But in the Eastern Roman Empire, in Persia, in India and China, literate, bureaucratic states kept humming. The fall of civilization was, in many ways, the fall of one particular model in one region. Recovery time? For Western Europe, several centuries to rebuild something with comparable complexity. For the species as a whole, essentially no delay. Chinese empires rose and fell. Indian mathematics advanced, Islamic scholars preserved and extended knowledge. Geographic scope? Regional, painful, but localized. Not even close to a global kill switch, the Bronze Age collapse. Different flavor, same pattern. Around 1200 BCE, multiple civilizations in the Eastern Mediterranean implode almost at once. Mycenaean Greece, the Hittite Empire, cities along the Levantine coast, trade networks that had moved copper, tin, grain, ideas, all snap. Population loss, regionally, serious, cities torched, palaces abandoned. But small farmers, pastoralists, inland communities, many of them survived, adapted, and in some cases benefited from the fall of their overlords. Cultural loss high, writing systems vanish in places. Complex palace bureaucracies disappear. Some technologies, like large-scale monument building and certain metalworking traditions, stall or regress. Recovery time? Centuries? You don't get recognizably new large states in Greece and the Levant until the Iron Age kingdoms and classical city-states. But again, the damage is patchy. Egypt limps, but does not die. Mesopotamia has a hard decade, then reconfigures, geographic scope. Eastern Mediterranean plus ripple effects inland. China, the Americas, Sub-Saharan Africa, on totally different timelines. The Bronze Age collapse is a terrifying regional reset, not a species level one. So far, every reset hurts badly somewhere, but nowhere touches the whole human map. For truly existential candidates, we have to go deeper in time, to Toba and the Younger Dryas. The Younger Dryas first, demographic impact, huge uncertainty. Hunter-gatherer populations are low to begin with. But the climate snap at the end of the last ice age, temperatures in the northern hemisphere dropping back to near-glacial conditions within decades, almost certainly slashed carrying capacity in many regions. In North America and Europe, megafauna die-offs, shrinking habitable zones, and disrupted food chains make survival hard. Cultural loss? Potentially large in relative terms. If there really were complex forager societies building monumental sites or experimenting with proto-agriculture before the crash, as some researchers argue from places like Göbekli Tepe, then a sudden return to harsh conditions could have erased whole developmental trajectories. But we're dealing in shadows and possibilities here, not clear written records. Recovery time? Long? It takes over 1,000 years for the climate to stabilise into the relatively warm, predictable Holocene that agriculture flourishes in. That means dozens of generations living in a fallback mode, holding on to whatever knowledge they can while just trying not to die. Geographic scope? Broad, but not uniform. The Younger Dryas is strongest in the North Atlantic system, but it shows up in different ways across much of the globe. This wasn't the end of humans, we know that, because we're here, but it likely slowed the path toward agriculture and complex societies by centuries or millennia. Now Toba. Here the numbers get scary. A supervolcano erupts in what is now Indonesia around 74,000 years ago. Ash spreads across South Asia. Sulfate aerosols in the stratosphere dim sunlight worldwide. Cooling, droughts, collapsing ecosystems, population loss. Genetic evidence suggests a bottleneck around this time frame, though the exact cause is still debated. Some models propose that the total number of breeding humans may have plunged to just a few thousand, maybe even lower. Not one empire collapsing, the entire species squeezed into a handful of refuges. Cultural loss? Massive, almost by definition. When you compress humanity into scattered pockets, entire tool traditions, languages, mythologies can disappear simply because one valley's clan doesn't make it out. Recovery time on the order of tens of thousands of years to go from that bottleneck state to the diverse, widespread populations we see in the late Pleistocene. Our rise after Toba is not a quick rebound. It's a long, slow, high-stakes climb. Geographic scope. Global climate impact. Local severity varied. Some regions may have been relative havens, but the atmospheric effects didn't respect borders. On our 4-part scoreboard, Toba sits in a different category. The Black Death, Rome's fall, the Bronze Age collapse, their civilization level resets within a still healthy species. Toba, if the bottleneck models are right, is a species level reset within a still hostile planet. What about the Younger Dryas versus Toba? The Younger Dryas is shorter and happens when humans are already behaviourally modern, with complex toolkits and wide dispersal. That likely boosts resilience. Toba is earlier when our species is fewer, more geographically constrained, and has less accumulated cultural capital. If you ask which reset came closest to erasing not just a civilization but the possibility of any future civilizations, Toba is the strongest contender. But there's a catch. The evidence is messy. Some climate records suggest Toba's cooling impact may have been milder than once thought. Some geneticists argue the bottleneck could have other causes or be spread over time. The Younger Dryas, meanwhile, may have kneecapped multiple emerging cultural experiments we barely have traces of. And looming over both is something else: the nuclear age and our own capacity for self-inflicted catastrophe. On paper, a full-scale thermonuclear war or runaway climate scenario could hit all four of our criteria harder and faster than any natural event in human history. So here's the cautious verdict. Among the ancient resets, Toba most likely brought us closest to the edge of biological extinction. The Younger Dryas may have been the deadliest for early Civilization Zero, wiping or delaying complex cultures just as they were getting started. The Bronze Age collapse, the Late Antique Crisis, and the Black Death were devastating for particular civilizations, but not for the species. That's not a final answer. New cores drilled from Antarctic ice, new genomes sequenced from ancient bones, new archaeological sites pulled from melting permafrost could still rewrite the rankings. In the end, the real power of this exercise isn't picking a winner. It's seeing the pattern. Humans have faced multiple doors with game over written on them. We've slipped past each one, sometimes through ingenuity, sometimes through luck, often through a combination of both. The uncomfortable question is whether Civilization 7 is walking toward a door that makes Toba look like a dress rehearsal. And that's where we go next. If you lived through Toba, or the Younger Dryas, or the Black Death, it probably felt like the end of the world. But there's one big difference between every reset we've talked about so far, and the one we might be walking into now. Back then, humans were passengers. Today, we're driving. For the first time in 4 billion years of Earth's history, a single species has the ability to rewrite the conditions of the entire planet on purpose or by accident. Start with the obvious one: nuclear weapons. A full-scale nuclear exchange isn't just a lot of cities get blown up. Models suggest firestorms lofting soot into the stratosphere, blocking sunlight for years. Global cooling collapse of agriculture, famine on a scale that makes past shortages look like supply hiccups. Unlike Toba, this wouldn't be a random volcanic tantrum. It would be a coordinated, system-wide punch we throw at ourselves. And because our population, our food, our energy are all tightly coupled, the blast radius demographic, cultural, geographic could be closer to truly global than anything we've ever experienced. Then there's climate change. We're doing in a few centuries what orbital cycles and tectonic drift do over tens of thousands of years, pushing the climate into a new regime. More heat in the oceans, shifting rainfall patterns. Meltwater pulses again, this time not from the tail end of an ice age, but from burning fossil sunlight, stored over hundreds of millions of years. Will that trigger another Younger Dryas-style snap? Probably not in the same way, but sea level rise that redraws coastlines, chronic droughts in breadbasket regions, heat waves that make outdoor labour lethal. Those are enough to destabilise a global civilization whose food system depends on just in-time logistics and cheap energy. Pandemics are the old enemy wearing a new mask. Pathogens have always been with us. The Black Death, smallpox, the 1918 flu. None needed airplanes to cross continents. But our world gives them a different playing field. Billions of humans, megacities, industrial farms packed with livestock, global flights stitching continents together in hours. A virus that once would have burned through one region and died out can now tour the planet before anyone even knows it exists. And then there's AI. Not in the sci-fi robot overlord sense, but as a force multiplier. Systems that can accelerate scientific discovery. Yes, but also hacking, surveillance, disinformation and weapon design. Tools that can help us stabilize the climate, or, in the wrong hands, destabilize societies faster than they can adapt. Notice the pattern? Nuclear war, climate disruption, engineered pandemics, misaligned AI. They're not independent dice rolls. They're entangled. A geopolitical crisis raises nuclear risk and cyber attacks. Climate stress fuels political instability. Instability lowers safety standards in labs and governance around powerful technologies. Each risk amplifies the others. Compare that to the Bronze Age. Back then, a few trade routes carried tin and copper across seas. When those snapped, palace economies imploded, but farmers inland kept planting barley. China didn't notice. The Americas didn't care. Our trade networks make those look like footpaths. Grain from one continent feeds animals on another to sell burgers in a third. Microchips fabricated in a handful of plants enable everything from power grids to hospital equipment. Energy markets, finance, information networks, all braided into a single dense web. Interconnectedness is our superpower. It lets knowledge move faster than genes, just like in the post-Toba expansion. It also means there are fewer fire breaks. A shock in one corner of the system can ricochet globally in days. So are resets cyclical? Are we due for number 8? History doesn't really work like a metronome. There's no cosmic schedule that says every X thousand years civilization must fall. What we see instead are vulnerabilities that rhyme: high complexity, heavy dependence on trade, energy transitions. Environmental stress. Elites insulated from feedback until it's too late. Those factors show up at the end of the Bronze Age, in late Rome before the Great Depression and World Wars. They're not fate, they're warning lights on the dashboard. The harder question is what recovery even means for a civilization as big as ours. After Rome, knowledge survived in monasteries, in Byzantium, in the Islamic world. After the Black Death, Europe rebounded into the Renaissance. After the Younger Dryas, foragers reinvented agriculture in multiple places. But today, there is no untouched continent, no large human population outside the global system. A deep reset now wouldn't be one region falling while others watch. It would be the entire species having to rebuild from a much lower level of complexity, on a planet whose easy resources are already mined, whose climate is already shifted. Iron ore near the surface? Mostly gone. Gigantic schools of fish and untouched old-growth forests? Largely gone. The next civilization, or the remnant of this one, would inherit a damaged but highly altered world. They might find our ruins, our data centers, our satellites decaying overhead. Their bottleneck wouldn't look like a few bands in Africa. It would be a scattered, traumatized sliver of 8 billion survivors. And yet, the earlier resets whisper something important. We are not here because our ancestors were safe. We are here because they were adaptable. Because tiny groups in appalling conditions kept sharing information, kept experimenting, kept trying new ways to live. The Toba survivors learned new strategies in a world turned grey. Foragers after the Younger Dryas invented farming. People stumbling through the wreckage of the Bronze Age eventually built classical philosophy, mathematics, and law. Medieval peasants who buried half their village in plague pits laid the economic groundwork for modern science and industry. Resilience wasn't a slogan for them, it was a set of behaviours. Diversify food sources, share risk through kinship and trade, remember old tricks, invent new ones, teach children relentlessly, cooperate when it matters most. Those instincts are still in us. So are we approaching Reset 8. We're certainly in a position where, for the first time, a reset could be triggered more by human decisions than by cosmic bad luck. The levers are in our hands. That makes the stakes higher, but it also means the outcome isn't written. We can harden systems instead of hollowing them out, build redundancies into food, energy, and health, govern dangerous technologies with something more than hope and handshakes. Treat past collapses not as distant curiosities but as case studies. If there's a pattern, it's not civilizations must fall. It's civilizations that ignore their own fragility eventually meet something they can't handle. The next chapter isn't guaranteed to be a fall or a triumph. It's an open interval between resets shaped by what billions of clever, anxious primates decide to do or not do in the brief moment when they realize they're both the passengers and the pilots. And that, more than any volcanic winter or ice age storm, is the real mystery we're living inside. So where does all of this leave us? We started with a strange idea that we might be the 7th iteration of complex human civilization. Not the 7th species, not the 7th empire, the 7th time our species, or something very close to it, has climbed up to large-scale, interconnected, fragile complexity. Reset 1, the Younger Dryas Cataclysm cutting down a warming world and any civilization 0 living on its coasts. Reset 2, the great post-glacial floods and meltwater pulses that may lie behind global flood myths, drowning the shorelines of Civilization 1. Reset 3, the 8.2 Kiloyear event and Black Sea Deluge slamming early farmers, shrinking their margins just as they were learning to rely on crops and herds. Reset 4, the Bronze Age collapse, when a whole network of palace states and trade routes fell apart so thoroughly that later people literally forgot how to write their names in the old scripts. Reset 5, the fall of Rome and the late antique Little Ice Age, when an empire that thought history was basically over-discovered that it absolutely was not. Reset 6, the Black Death, a biological hammer that erased up to half the population in some regions and rewired the social and economic circuitry of Eurasia, and then the long, uneven rise into Civilization 7, exploration, fossil fuels, industrialization, digital networks, a truly global system sitting on top of all those earlier experiments, all those graves. Looking back across the timeline, we tried to rank which reset came closest to wiping us out for good. The deep genetic scar of the 900,000-year bottleneck still stands alone as the moment our species almost didn't make it into the future at all. But within recorded and reconstructed history, Toba's shadow likely looms largest, a reset so severe it may have narrowed our breeding population to a few thousand, maybe fewer, concentrating our fate into something like that meta-population game of whack-a-mole all over again. Everything since then, Ice Age snaps, flood pulses, city burnings, plagues, has been brutal at the scale of cultures, but survivable at the scale of the species. Painful resets, not true endings. That's the eerie through line. 6 times, complex systems have crashed. 6 times the story has bent, but not broken. Every reset shredded specific worlds, a fishing culture on a now drowned shelf, a Mycenaean palace, a Roman frontier town, a medieval village. But somewhere else, some stubborn cluster of humans kept a thin line of continuity alive. Knowledge, tools, stories, seeds. We walk around inside that inheritance every day. Our resilience isn't magic. It's the accumulated result of millions of decisions by frightened, clever people who refuse to stop adapting. If you want to keep digging into that mystery with me, how fragile our world is, and how weirdly durable our species has been, make sure you hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe. It really does tell the algorithm that this kind of long-form, deep-time storytelling is worth showing to more people. And I'd love to hear from you personally. Tell me in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? City, country, ancient coastline if you know it. One of the coolest parts of this channel is seeing this scattered global meta-population of viewers check in from everywhere. If you want to support the show in the best possible way, the number one thing you can do is listen on Spotify. The link is down in the description. Every listen there helps me keep doing the research, the scripts, and the late-night rabbit holes that turn into videos like this. We are the descendants of 6 resets, and the pilots of whatever comes next.